The desert is not silent. It breathes, sighs, and remembers. Long before the first European mapmakers ever drew a shaky circle around the word Timbuktu, the Sahara was already guarding its secrets beneath an ocean of shifting gold. At sunrise, the dunes glow like embers, each ridge holding shadows that stretch for miles, shadows that seem almost alive, as if shaped by the memories of countless caravans that once cut across this endless expanse. The wind moves softly at first, brushing grains of sand across the surface like a hand turning the pages of an ancient book, then rising, swirling, and erasing footprints as quickly as they appear. In this ever-changing landscape, nothing is permanent, except the stories. For centuries, those stories whispered of a place so improbable, so unlikely, that it sounded more like a mirage than a real city. A sanctuary of scholars hidden deep within a hostile desert. A place where knowledge, fragile as it is, was protected not by stone walls or armies, but by faith, by devotion, and by an understanding that some truths are too precious to abandon to the whims of time. Even today, if you stand at the edge of the Sahara at dawn, you can almost feel that memory stirring beneath the sand. A subtle reminder that this landscape has witnessed empires rise and fall, but it has also shielded something far more enduring than politics or power. The journey toward that hidden sanctuary begins not with the city itself, but with the desert's overwhelming magnitude. Travelers approaching Timbuktu centuries ago did so with a mixture of fear and reverence. Many had never seen anything like the Sahara. Its dunes taller than towers, its heat heavy enough to press on the lungs, its nights colder than stone. They often described it as a test of the spirit, a purification, a crucible. The desert stripped away illusions, stripped away comfort, and demanded humility. Only those who respected it survived crossing it. And yet, through this unforgiving terrain came caravans carrying more than just gold or salt. They carried questions, ideas, stories from distant lands. Scholars from Morocco, merchants from Cairo, philosophers from Andalusia, all drawn by rumors of a city where the world's most unexpected archive existed, hidden behind mud-brick walls and guarded by people who believed knowledge was a form of worship. They came because they sensed, even without proof, that in this improbable place, something extraordinary had taken root. Imagine the sight of a caravan cresting a dune after weeks of travel. Faces burned by the sun, robes stiff with sand, camels moving in slow, deliberate rhythm. Every person in that line knew the danger. There were bandits waiting in the desert's deeper shadows, storms that could bury an entire caravan overnight, mirages that lured the thirsty toward their deaths. Yet they continued onward, driven by the same force that pushes explorers across oceans and scientists into the unknown. An unshakable curiosity, a belief that what lies ahead might change everything. Then, one morning, after endless dunes and blinding days, the travelers would see it. Low, earthen buildings rising from the desert floor like an apparition, minarets shaped from sun-baked clay, courtyards filled with the fragrance of acacia wood. A city that did not glitter with wealth, yet radiated something rarer, something almost magnetic. Timbuktu did not astonish with monuments. It astonished with its stillness, its sense of presence, as if the city itself understood its place in the flow of history. The first thing visitors noticed was the quiet. Not the empty quiet of the desert, but a living silence, the silence of deep concentration. In the narrow streets, men in white and indigo robes walked with calm purpose. Students gathered under the shade of wooden beams, memorizing lines from books that had traveled across continents. The air carried the soft murmur of debates drifting out of open-air schools. And above it all, the desert wind wove through the town like a gentle breath, reminding everyone that knowledge here existed against all odds. But what struck travelers most was the contrast. Outside the city walls stretched a brutal landscape capable of swallowing entire expeditions whole. Inside those walls, ideas flowed more freely than water. Arguments about astronomy, theology, mathematics, medicine, disciplines that in some other parts of the world were restricted to elite circles or guarded jealously, were openly discussed among scholars who considered learning a communal duty. It was as if the harshness of the desert sharpened the minds of those who lived on its edge, fueling an intellectual culture that seemed almost impossible given the environment. Even centuries later, historians struggle to explain how such an unlikely place became a lighthouse of knowledge. There was no major river feeding it, no fertile plain nurturing a large population. Yet for a time, Timbuktu became one of the brightest intellectual centers on Earth, drawing thinkers the way the first libraries once drew pilgrims. And somewhere in the heart of this strange, serene city, hidden behind locked chests and thick mud walls, were manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them, containing ideas bold enough to shape empires, sciences, and spiritual traditions. The desert knew their value, protected them with its silence. But it also attracted those who feared them, those who believed that knowledge, if not controlled, could challenge authority itself. The sand remembers their footsteps too. Conquerors, invaders, explorers, and thieves. People who came not to study, but to seize. And yet, the manuscripts survive them all. As the wind continues to shift the dunes, revealing fragments of forgotten paths, one truth becomes clear. The Sahara is not a barrier. It is a guardian. Every grain of sand that brushes against Timbuktu's ancient walls is a reminder that history often hides its most precious treasures in places most people never think to look. And as dawn spreads across the desert, casting long shadows that point toward the city's heart, a single question rises with the light, demanding to be answered. If this improbable city held knowledge powerful enough to change empires, what exactly was hidden in its archives? And who risked everything to protect it? Before Timbuktu became a legend, it was a whisper, an almost unbelievable rumor carried along the great caravan routes like smoke on the desert wind. In the world before maps, knowledge traveled through stories, and these stories often arrived long before the truth did. Merchants moving from the Niger River basin toward North Africa would pause at remote wells, share their water, rest their camels, and, in hushed tones, speak of a city that defied the logic of the desert. A city not rich because of its gold, but because of something far rarer, its ideas. These early whispers described Timbuktu as a place where scholars gathered in numbers greater than the soldiers who guarded it. A place where handwritten books were traded at prices higher than the finest gold dust. Something about those reports felt impossible, even fantastical. How could a city isolated by dunes stretching to the horizon contain such intellectual wealth? How could a region many outsiders assumed was empty produce libraries that rivaled the greatest centers of learning in the known world? Yet the rumors persisted. They grew with every caravan, shifting slightly, gaining new details. Some spoke of vast learning circles where debates lasted until the stars faded. Others claimed that ancient manuscripts were copied by entire families, passed from generation to generation as sacred heirlooms. A few stories went even further, describing forbidden texts, books on astronomy, alchemy, mysticism that had no parallel anywhere else. The more outlandish the tale, the more it stuck in the minds of those who heard it. For many merchants, Timbuktu existed in two forms: the real city they visited to trade salt and gold, and the mythical version they described to others, glowing with mystery and exaggeration. Over time, the myth proved more powerful than the truth. Explorers in Mediterranean trading ports listened with wide eyes as sailors and traders told them of a golden city hidden in the heart of the Sahara. Scholars in European universities debated whether such a place could possibly exist. Some believed the stories. Many scoffed. A few became obsessed. But the caravans kept coming. Imagine standing in the desert at dusk, waiting for the first signs of a caravan's arrival. The heat of the day fades, the horizon trembles with the cooling air, and somewhere in the distance a low, rhythmic sound emerges, the slow padding of camel feet. Then shapes appear, tall, swaying silhouettes moving like shadows given life. At the front rides the caravan leader, his face wrapped to shield from wind and sand. Behind him stretch dozens of camels burdened with goods, and behind them, men guiding the animals with patience born of necessity. Their robes carry the dust of nations. Their eyes reflect weeks of fatigue. But once they settle near a well, once the animals are watered and fires are lit, they begin to talk. The stories flow as freely as the tea they brew, hot and bitter. They speak of marketplaces where scholars rather than merchants dominate the conversations. They describe streets lined with wooden doors carved with verses from memory. They tell of teachers whose reputations reach across deserts, teachers whose words attract students from Fez, Tripoli, Cairo, and beyond. Hearing such tales beneath the stars, one could almost believe Timbuktu was not a city at all, but a dream made real. A dream shaped by the hopes of those who longed for knowledge in a world often ruled by force. As word spread, Timbuktu became a kind of intellectual beacon. It called to wanderers of all kinds. Young men eager to study law, mystics seeking spiritual guidance, astronomers searching for lost texts, and merchants hoping to profit from the trade in rare manuscripts. Some travelers arrived prepared. Others arrived humbled, realizing quickly that surviving the desert crossing was only the first test. Many who left for Timbuktu never returned, claimed by sandstorms or bandits. Yet the stories they left behind only strengthened the city's mystique. What fascinated people most was the claim that knowledge in Timbuktu was not hoarded, it was shared. Scholars gathered in open-air courtyards under simple wooden frames. Students sat on mats placed directly on the warm earth. Lessons were not confined to rigid schedules. They flowed with the rhythm of the day, influenced by prayer times and the rising or setting of the sun. In many ways, learning in Timbuktu felt alive, undisturbed by the rigidity found in distant kingdoms. And this openness made the rumors even more compelling. But not everyone viewed Timbuktu's reputation through the lens of wonder. Some saw danger in the idea of a city where intellectual authority overshadowed political might. A place where the written word could challenge rulers and reshape empires. These concerns traveled just as swiftly as the romanticized tales. Where some heard opportunity, others sensed a threat. Knowledge, after all, is a currency far more unpredictable than gold. As the centuries passed, the whispers evolved into something sharper, an obsession. Explorers from faraway lands became determined to uncover the truth. Some hoped to find unimaginable wealth. Others wanted to map the unknown. A few simply wanted to see if a city built on scholarship could truly exist in a landscape so hostile that the very thought defied logic. What none of them understood yet was that Timbuktu's greatest treasure was not its architecture, its markets, or even its manuscripts. Its true wealth lay in the minds of the people who lived there, and in the fragile pages they guarded with their lives. As caravans continued their endless march across the desert, carrying both rumors and reality, they set in motion a chain of events that would soon draw the world's attention to Timbuktu. The whispers had become louder, the curiosity deeper, and the stakes far higher. Something extraordinary waited in that remote city, something powerful enough to attract kings, conquerors, and dreamers. And those who followed the whispers would soon discover that not all knowledge is welcomed by those who rule, and not every truth wants to be found. Gold and salt may seem like simple commodities today, but in the world that shaped Timbuktu, they were the lifeblood of nations. They fueled armies, built monuments, toppled kingdoms, and carried silent power across continents. But hidden beneath the glitter of gold and the sparkle of salt was something far more potent: knowledge. And it was this unexpected fusion of wealth and wisdom that transformed Timbuktu from a trading outpost into a force that altered the destiny of empires. To understand the rise of this extraordinary city, you must picture the ancient trade networks like veins stretching across a giant body. The Sahara, despite its harshness, was not a barrier. It was a road, an immense, dangerous, and demanding road, but a road nonetheless. Merchants did not travel because they wanted to. They traveled because civilization depended on them. And in the heart of these interconnected routes lay Timbuktu, positioned at the perfect crossroads between the markets of West Africa and the intellectual centers of the North. Caravans carried gold from the forests and rivers of the South, where nuggets could be found shimmering beneath shallow waters. That gold moved northward through desert towns and into the hands of traders who supplied the Mediterranean world. Meanwhile, salt, the very substance that could preserve life in scorching climates, moved southward in massive slabs cut from ancient deposits deep in the desert. A single camel could carry hundreds of pounds, but each pound was precious enough to spark conflict. Timbuktu became the place where these two worlds, north and south, rich and richer, met. Traders arriving in the city were greeted by markets alive with movement. Camels kneeling to unload their cargo, merchants haggling under woven canopies, and the constant hum of negotiations that could shift the balance of wealth across generations. But even among the bustle, even among the overflowing goods from distant lands, something else stood out. Something less visible but infinitely more valuable. Books. At first, outsiders could hardly believe it. In many cities, books were locked away in royal libraries or religious institutions. Rare, tightly controlled, used only by elites. But in Timbuktu, books were not rare, they were everywhere. They were bought and sold like spices, copied in dim rooms by skilled hands, discussed in open courtyards, and valued more highly than gold itself. Some traders from North Africa arrived expecting to profit from gold or salt, but left the city reflecting on ideas they had heard in a lesson attended purely out of curiosity. A debate about astronomy. A lecture on jurisprudence. A poem recited with such emotion that it stayed with them long after they returned to their homelands. In Timbuktu, trade was not merely economic, it was intellectual. A visiting merchant might arrive with caravans heavy with salt, but leave carrying thoughts that would influence scholars thousands of miles away. Why was knowledge so treasured here? The answer lies in a cultural belief embedded deep in West African history. Knowledge was a divine trust. It was believed to be a form of light, something shared freely so the world could be illuminated. This philosophy shaped everything. It shaped how children were raised, how families passed down traditions, and how elders taught the young. Knowledge was not a possession, it was a responsibility. And so, as gold and salt flowed through the city, manuscripts flowed even more freely. They traveled along the same trade routes, carried in leather satchels and wrapped in cloth to protect them from harsh winds. Some came from Cairo, others from Fez, Tunis, Cordoba, and distant Andalusian centers. A single manuscript could cross 3 continents before reaching Timbuktu, where it might be copied carefully by a local scholar and debated in open-air classrooms. Every new text added a new voice to the intellectual chorus of the city. But this exchange also attracted attention, dangerous attention. Knowledge can empower, but it can also destabilize. It challenges assumptions, undermines dogma, and creates new possibilities. And while Timbuktu embraced this vision, the empires surrounding it did not always share the same enthusiasm. Leaders who sought control understood the power flowing into this desert city was not simply economic, it was ideological. If ideas could be traded more freely than gold, then who truly controlled the region? As Timbuktu's libraries grew, so did the unease among neighboring powers. Some viewed the city as a jewel worth possessing. Others saw it as a rival to be restricted. A city whose treasury was not counted in coins, but in knowledge, posed an unusual threat. It could influence the thinking of future generations, shape the laws of distant lands, and inspire movements that rulers could not predict or suppress. And yet, despite these mounting tensions, Timbuktu continued to blossom. Wealth from gold and salt gave rise to a flourishing marketplace, and this wealth in turn funded scholars, teachers, and scribes. Students from across the Sahara arrived with nothing but determination, hoping to study under renowned teachers whose reputations spanned continents. Many spent years in the city, memorizing texts, debating, copying manuscripts line by line. A slow, relentless devotion that built one of the greatest intellectual traditions in African history. The truth was simple. Timbuktu thrived because it united 2 forms of wealth. Material wealth brought the caravans. Intellectual wealth made them stay. And this combination created something rare in human history. A city where merchants and scholars lived side by side, each dependent on the other, each reshaping the world in ways they could not fully understand. While caravans brought gold and salt, manuscripts carried ideas that would outlast both commodities, ideas that would ripple outward, influencing distant courts, inspiring poets, and challenging thinkers in cities that had never seen the Sahara. But such influence could not remain unnoticed forever. As the fame of Timbuktu's scholars spread, The ambitions of kings and conquerors sharpened. The desert, once the protector of knowledge, began to hide a growing storm. Rival factions watched the city with a hunger no trade treaty could satisfy. The wealth of Timbuktu, its gold, its salt, its manuscripts, had become too visible. Those who coveted that wealth were coming. And the city's guardians knew that the knowledge which once connected the world could soon become the very spark that ignited its greatest dangers. Long before the manuscripts of Timbuktu were admired by historians or displayed in climate-controlled archives, they lived in the hands of ordinary people, families whose names rarely appeared in official records, but whose devotion preserved an entire civilization's memory. They were not kings, not generals, not wealthy merchants. They were copyists, scholars, and guardians who believed that the written word was a living inheritance, something that breathed through ink and parchment. In rooms lit only by oil lamps, they worked through nights that stretched like eternities, shaping the destiny of ideas that would outlive even the empires surrounding them. The first guardians of the word were often children before they were scholars. In many households, learning to read came before learning to trade, and learning to write came before even learning to bargain. A child's earliest memory might be the smell of ink, thick, slightly metallic, made from soot or crushed seeds, and the soft scratch of a reed pen dragged across smooth parchment. Parents taught their children that copying a text was more than a task. It was an act of devotion, a form of spiritual discipline. Every letter carried responsibility. Every sentence carried truth. In these families, the manuscripts were not mere objects, they were lifelines. They represented generations of accumulated wisdom, the teachings of elders, the reflections of scholars, the poetry of mystics, the calculations of astronomers, the legal rulings of judges. To lose a manuscript was to lose a piece of identity, a piece of memory, a piece of one's ancestors. This belief infused every aspect of their lives. Rooms were built with hidden alcoves for storage. Trunks were carved with reinforced lids. Pages were wrapped in cloth to guard them from heat and dust. Even during celebrations or social gatherings, family members kept a watchful eye on the shelves, the chests, the bundles of manuscripts tucked away in quiet corners. And yet, the work of copying manuscripts was far from glamorous. It demanded patience, endurance, and a kind of humility that few people could master. A single manuscript could take months to replicate, more if it contained diagrams, complex charts, or layered commentaries. Copyists had to maintain consistent handwriting, preserve accuracy, and sometimes even correct old errors, all while maintaining absolute respect for the original text. A scribe might spend hours crafting a perfect page, only to discover one misplaced mark, one smudge, one imperfection that forced them to start over. But still, they continued. Their work took place in spaces almost sacred in their simplicity. Mud brick rooms with small windows, wooden desks angled toward shafts of sunlight, ink pots held steady by stone rings carved generations earlier. The air inside these rooms seemed thicker, denser, as if saturated with centuries of concentrated thought. When the wind blew outside, carrying sand across the rooftops like waves breaking against a shore, it felt as if the desert itself was listening, holding its breath as the scribes committed their ideas to paper. These families were the true engines of Timbuktu's intellectual life. They were the quiet force behind the city's reputation, the invisible network that ensured ideas could travel across time. Scholars teaching at Sankor and other learning centers relied on them. Merchants commissioned them. Students copied their copies. Every manuscript that passed through the city bore traces of their hands, their discipline, their commitment. Among the earliest guardians were those whose names we still whisper today. The Haidar family, the Kadi family, the Akit family, and many others whose contributions were never recorded formally but lived on through their work. Their homes doubled as miniature libraries, with stacks of manuscripts lining walls from floor to ceiling. Some houses had courtyards where lessons were held. Others had basements where rare texts were kept cool. A few even built hidden rooms behind false walls, accessible only through narrow passageways known to the family alone. But devotion came with sacrifice. Copying was exhausting, both mentally and physically. Eyes strained under dim lamplight, fingers cramped from hours of writing. Ink stained their hands permanently, creating patterns that almost looked like callous tattoos. And while scholars were respected, they were not always wealthy. Many families lived modestly, relying on small payments from students or patrons. They accepted this reality without complaint because they believed the preservation of knowledge was a higher calling, one that demanded service without expectation of fame or fortune. Their sacrifices grew even greater during times of danger. Whenever whispers of invasion reached Timbuktu, panic did not first sweep through the markets or the palaces. It swept through the libraries. Families immediately began hiding their manuscripts, wrapping them in cloth, burying them in wooden chests, or sealing them inside clay jars hidden beneath the sand. The fear was always the same. Not the loss of material wealth, but the loss of something irreplaceable. A manuscript burned was a voice erased forever. A library destroyed was a lineage cut short. During these periods, the guardians of knowledge worked with astonishing calm. They often moved at night, carrying bundles across rooftops or through alleys illuminated only by moonlight. Children helped too, learning early that the fate of their heritage depended on silence, secrecy, and courage. Some manuscripts were hidden inside wells. Others were kept in the walls of mosques. A few were entrusted to nomadic tribes who carried them deep into the desert for safekeeping. For the guardians, their greatest fear was not that the manuscripts would be stolen. It was that they would be misunderstood, taken by those who saw only the physical object, not the meaning behind it. To them, a manuscript was not just ink and parchment. It was a soul. The guardians understood something else too. Knowledge is fragile. It survives only when passed on, only when cared for, only when treated as living. And so they treated every letter with reverence, every margin note with attention, every commentary with the seriousness of prophecy. What these early families could not have known, what they could never have imagined, was how many times their dedication would save the libraries of Timbuktu. They did not know that centuries later, foreign explorers would come searching for the manuscripts with equal parts curiosity and greed. They did not know that armed forces in different eras would threaten their collections again and again. They did not know that their descendants would one day risk their lives during modern conflicts to save the very same texts. All they knew was that preserving knowledge was their duty, their fate, their legacy. The manuscripts of Timbuktu survived not because they were hidden behind walls or protected by armies, but because the guardians of the word, ordinary families with extraordinary devotion, chose to protect them with their lives. And as their lamps flickered through long, silent nights, each stroke of the pen became a quiet act of resistance, a declaration that no empire, no conqueror, no force of nature would ever erase the truth written in those pages. The manuscripts of Timbuktu were never meant to be silent artifacts locked away in display cases. They were living things, voices that carried across borders, challenging minds far beyond the desert. Long before outsiders understood their significance, these manuscripts shaped debates that rippled through kingdoms, crossed oceans, and unsettled the foundations of distant empires. Every page held a spark capable of igniting new ways of thinking. And it was this power, not gold, not salt, that made Timbuktu both revered and feared. For scholars in the city, the knowledge they preserved was not confined to local concerns. Their writings engaged with the world. In mathematical texts, you find sophisticated geometry used to determine prayer times, seasonal patterns, and celestial movements. In medical manuscripts, you find detailed descriptions of surgical techniques, herbal treatments, psychological observations, and public health guidance centuries ahead of their time. In philosophical works, you find reflections that mirrored questions being debated simultaneously in Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba, yet expressed in voices deeply rooted in West African experience. But beyond their brilliance, these manuscripts carried something more dangerous: intellectual independence. Timbuktu did not imitate, contributed, and that contribution disrupted narratives many empires relied upon. In an age when certain rulers claimed to be the sole carriers of enlightenment, the idea of a desert city producing advanced scientific, legal, and philosophical work was not just surprising, it was threatening. Knowledge is power, and when that power emerges from unexpected places, it reshapes the political landscape. Some manuscripts proposed legal interpretations that empowered ordinary people rather than elites. Others offered economic principles emphasizing fairness and moral accountability, an idea unsettling to rulers who thrived on exploitation. Still others presented astronomical models and cosmological theories that questioned long-held assumptions. These texts were not stored in royal courts where rulers could restrict them. They circulated among scholars, students, and travelers. Ideas born in Timbuktu did not stay in Timbuktu, and this movement of knowledge frightened those who feared change. Among the manuscripts were treatises that subtly challenged authoritarian rule, works on social justice, commentaries advocating intellectual freedom, spiritual texts suggesting that truth could not be owned by institutions. These writings did not openly rebel, but they planted seeds. And when seeds of knowledge take root, they become impossible to control. Even traders who visited the city noticed this unique dynamic. They observed how students posed questions boldly, how scholars engaged in debate without fear of contradiction, how the pursuit of truth was valued above allegiance to any ruler. This environment, open, fluid, intellectually alive, stood in stark contrast to societies where speaking a forbidden idea could cost one's life. The manuscripts also contained insights that outsiders did not expect to find in West Africa. Some described complex navigational techniques. Others documented sophisticated agricultural systems, trade networks, and environmental strategies tailored to the Sahel's challenging climate. These were not primitive societies struggling to survive. They were advanced civilizations mastering their environment with skill and wisdom. But perhaps the greatest threat the manuscripts posed was their ability to humanize and dignify a region outsiders dismissed. In a time when early European and Middle Eastern empires built their power partly on controlling narratives, on deciding who was civilized and who was not, the existence of extensive scholarly traditions in Timbuktu undermined those claims. If West Africa had intellectual centers rivaling the great universities of the world, then the simplistic hierarchies created by imperial powers were illusions. So the manuscripts became symbols of contesting worldviews, and empires began to take notice. Some saw opportunity. If they could access Timbuktu's knowledge, they could expand their own power. Others saw a threat. If these manuscripts inspired resistance or equality or new political interpretations, they could destabilize regions those empires hoped to dominate. This tension simmered beneath the surface long before armies marched toward the city. Scholars sensed it. They saw signs in the rumors spreading along trade routes, in letters exchanged with colleagues in distant lands, in the shifting tone of travelers who arrived not with curiosity but with calculation. And so the guardians of knowledge grew more cautious. They began limiting which manuscripts were shown to which visitors. They cataloged their collections privately, creating discrete inventories known only within families. They trained their children to read between the lines, not only the texts but the intentions of those who sought them. They understood that a manuscript could be used to enlighten, but also to manipulate or control. The written word was powerful, and those who feared that power were beginning to move toward Timbuktu with increasing determination. Scholars also saw another warning: the growing interest of foreign explorers who heard rumors of a golden city. Some arrived pretending to be traders, others disguised as pilgrims. A few were sincere, but many were not. They came asking questions that revealed their ambitions. They sought descriptions of the libraries, the number of manuscripts, the subjects covered. Some asked about texts dealing with governance, spirituality, or political theory, topics that could be exploited by anyone seeking to dominate the region. The people of Timbuktu had always been generous with knowledge, but they were not naive. They sensed the changing tides and responded with careful discretion. Yet, even with all their caution, the manuscripts kept attracting attention. Why? Because knowledge, especially knowledge that challenges established narratives, is magnetic. It draws in the curious, the ambitious, the uncertain, and the hungry. The manuscripts of Timbuktu contained ideas that were not bound by geography. They spoke to universal questions about existence, morality, justice, the cosmos, and human purpose. Their insights resonated far beyond the desert. They resonated across continents, shaking assumptions and expanding the boundaries of what people believed was possible. And in this way, Timbuktu unintentionally positioned itself at the center of an intellectual map that few empires were prepared to acknowledge. It became a lighthouse, one that illuminated truths many wanted to keep hidden. But such light invites shadows, and shadows were gathering. The manuscripts, once only tools of learning, now carried geopolitical weight. Their influence stretched into courts, trading hubs, religious circles, and academic centers. And those who wanted control began preparing to seize it. The knowledge contained in these fragile pages had challenged empires without ever leaving the desert. Now, those empires were preparing to challenge Timbuktu in return. The guardians felt it coming. The scholars sensed it. The desert, timeless and watchful, felt it too. A storm was approaching, and the manuscripts were at the center of it. To step into Sankor during Timbuktu's golden age was to enter a world where knowledge felt alive, where learning did not sit quietly on shelves, but moved through the air like music, carried by voices of scholars who spoke with passion, conviction, and wonder. Sankor was not a single building. It was a constellation of learning spaces, interconnected through tradition, memory, and devotion. It breathed like a living organism, growing not through stone and mortar, but through ideas that flowed from teacher to student, from generation to generation. The university began modestly, with small classes held in open courtyards shaded by wooden beams and palm mats. Over time, it expanded into a network of study circles, scholarly homes, and mosques, each acting as a node in a vast intellectual web. Lessons took place anywhere they were needed. Beneath acacia trees, along the edges of courtyards, inside rooms painted in warm ochre, or under the sky itself. When the desert wind swept across the city, stirring dust into shimmering patterns, it did not disrupt the lessons. It became part of the rhythm of learning. Imagine a typical day at Sankor during its height. The first call to prayer echoes across the rooftops at dawn, awakening the city with a calm, deliberate cadence. As the sun rises, casting soft golden light over the mud-brick buildings, students begin gathering in small groups. They carry bundles of manuscripts wrapped carefully in leather or cloth, protecting them from the dust. Some bring wooden tablets for writing. Others come empty-handed but full of anticipation. Many wear robes in white, cream, or indigo, their colors blending harmoniously with the warm tones of the desert city. Their teachers, some elderly and revered, others young and prodigiously gifted, sit on raised mats or simple cushions. They rarely sit above their students, preferring instead to engage them at eye level. Teaching here is not performed with authority, but with humility. The role of a scholar is not to dominate, but to guide. Knowledge is treated as a shared journey, not a possession. The lessons begin with recitations. Students read passages aloud, their voices overlapping in a gentle chorus. Some stutter nervously, others speak with flowing confidence. The teacher listens patiently, occasionally stopping the reader to ask a question, point out a nuance in the text, or draw a connection to another manuscript. A debate might spark suddenly, two students offering contrasting interpretations of a line of law, a verse of poetry, or a theological argument. Rather than suppress the disagreement, the teacher encourages it, pushing them to defend their ideas with evidence, clarity, and respect. Sankor's beauty lies in this openness. It is not a place where knowledge trickles downward from teacher to student in a single stream. It is a place where knowledge circulates, where every voice matters, where a student's insight can illuminate a new understanding even for the most seasoned scholar. And this environment, so rare in many academic centers of the time, created a culture where critical thinking flourished. Some students spent a single year in Timbuktu. Others stayed for decades, immersing themselves in a vast curriculum that could range from jurisprudence, theology, and poetry to mathematics, medicine, astronomy, linguistics, and trade law. The city's scholars were polymaths, individuals who could recite poetry in the morning, calculate the position of Venus in the afternoon, and deliver a lecture on ethics in the evening. This multidisciplinarity created a unique intellectual ecosystem, where ideas from one field nourished breakthroughs in another. A visitor walking through Sankor during this era would feel overwhelmed, not by noise but by purpose. One courtyard might host a discussion on the movement of celestial bodies, with a teacher drawing diagrams in the sand using a small wooden stick. Nearby, a circle of students might be reciting works of classical poetry. Across the way, a legal scholar might be explaining the complexities of inheritance law to a group of merchants preparing for future negotiations. What made Sankor exceptional was not its physical size, but its intellectual gravity. It attracted minds from across Africa, the Mediterranean, and even beyond. Students traveled from regions hundreds or thousands of miles away, enduring dangerous routes and spending fortunes to reach this desert city. They came because Sankor offered something universities in Europe and the Middle East rarely granted so freely: intellectual independence. Here, scholars were not bound by royal politics. They were not silenced by dogma. They debated rulers' decisions openly. They challenged traditions thoughtfully. And in doing so, they created a safe haven for ideas that might have been dismissed or punished elsewhere. But Sankor was more than a university. It was a cultural engine. Its influence extended into everyday life. Merchants relied on its scholars for mediation. Families sought guidance from its jurists. Poets performed their works in its courtyards. Medical practitioners trained under its physicians, learning practical healing techniques as well as spiritual approaches. Its reach extended into the very fabric of society. And all of this would have remained local, beautiful but contained, had it not been for something extraordinary. Sankor's teachers produced manuscripts, and manuscripts traveled. Through caravans, letters, and visits from foreign scholars, the writings born in Sankor circulated far beyond Timbuktu. A treatise written in one of its classrooms could end up in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, or even as far as Turkey. Ideas crafted in a desert courtyard could shape debates in distant courts and scholarly gatherings. In this way, the intellectual light of Timbuktu reached across continents. The university's prestige grew with every generation. Its reputation spread through stories carried by merchants, scholars, and travelers. Some described it as an oasis of knowledge. Others called it the lamp of the Sahel. A few insisted it was the greatest intellectual center they had ever seen, rivaling Cairo's Al-Azhar or the madrasas of Fez. And yet, for all its brilliance, Sankor remained humble. Its buildings were not adorned with marble or decorated with gold. Its classrooms were not enclosed by towering walls. Its library rooms were simple, sometimes little more than mud chambers with shelves made of wood. What made Sankor extraordinary was not its physical form, but its spirit. But something changed the trajectory of the university forever. The arrival of a ruler whose vision would elevate Timbuktu to heights even its founders could not have imagined. He came not with armies, but with ambition. Not with conquest, but with belief. A belief that knowledge was the true measure of greatness. A belief that would transform Sankor from a respected regional center into one of the greatest universities the medieval world had ever known. His name was Mansa Musa, and when he stepped into Timbuktu, the golden age of learning was about to rise into something even more dazzling, something that would echo through history long after the empires of men had turned to dust. Long before historians crowned him the richest man who ever lived, before his name passed into legend as a symbol of almost unimaginable wealth, Mansa Musa was something far more complex and far more human. He was a ruler shaped by faith, ambition, and an abiding belief that greatness was measured not merely by gold, but by what one left behind. When he ascended to the throne of the Mali Empire in the early 14th century, he inherited a vast realm of forests, rivers, and caravan cities. But what he envisioned for his empire was greater still, a civilization illuminated by knowledge. To understand his impact on Timbuktu, you must imagine him not as a distant monarch seated on a throne, but as a man who saw the world with hungry, curious eyes. When he traveled, he watched how other kingdoms built their institutions, how they nurtured their scholars, how they preserved the wisdom of the past. He didn't merely observe these things, he absorbed them. And his greatest opportunity to reshape his empire came during the most extraordinary journey of his life: his pilgrimage to Mecca. No account of medieval history describes anything like it. His caravan stretched across miles. Tens of thousands of people, soldiers, attendants, and traders, Camels carried gold dust in leather bags, so much gold that Musa's generosity during his travels disrupted entire economies. In Cairo, the markets trembled under the flood of wealth he released. In the Red Sea ports, stories circulated of a king whose riches exceeded imagination. But what most overlooked was the deeper purpose behind his pilgrimage. Mansa Musa used his journey not only to fulfill his religious obligation, but to study the intellectual and architectural wonders of the Islamic world. He visited great mosques in Cairo and Medina. He sat with scholars whose reputations echoed across continents. He observed universities, libraries, and institutions dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. And in these moments of observation, a conviction formed within him. Mali, too, could become a beacon of learning. Timbuktu, already known for its scholars, could become its shining heart. When Musa returned home, he was no longer simply a wealthy king. He was a visionary on a mission. And with him, he brought something far more valuable than gold. He brought minds. Architects, scholars, poets, calligraphers, theologians, men whose talents would help reshape Timbuktu into one of the greatest intellectual capitals of its age. Among them was perhaps the most famous, the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq Saheli, whose elegant designs would influence West African architecture for generations. Under Musa's patronage, Timbuktu transformed. Mosques were rebuilt with grandeur and intention. The Sankor complex expanded, shaped into an institution that rivaled the great learning centers of the Mediterranean and Middle East. Libraries multiplied. Manuscripts poured into the city from all corners of the known world. And scholars, brilliant, restless, curious scholars, followed one another like migrating birds seeking a warmer climate for the mind. To the people of Timbuktu, Musa's investment was not merely a royal project. It was a cultural awakening. Students who once studied in modest courtyards now found themselves in spaces with beautifully carved wooden beams, intricate geometric patterns, and open-air classrooms capable of hosting hundreds. Families who had guarded their manuscripts for generations now had even more incentive to preserve, copy, and expand their collections. Knowledge, once flowing steadily, began to surge. It would be easy to imagine Musa as a distant benefactor, removed from the daily life of the city. But he was far more involved. Chronicles describe him visiting scholars, listening to debates, asking questions. He sought counsel not only from military leaders, but from jurists, philosophers, and astronomers. In an age where many rulers feared intellectual challenge, Musa embraced it. He saw knowledge as a stabilizing force, a foundation upon which his empire could flourish long after he was gone. And it worked. Under Mansa Musa, Timbuktu entered its golden age. The city thrummed with intellectual energy. Caravans arrived from North Africa carrying manuscripts instead of mere goods. Students traveled from distant lands, knowing that a degree earned in Timbuktu carried prestige recognized across the Islamic world. The teachings born in Musa's Timbuktu shaped legal practices, influenced trade policies, and echoed in theological debates far from the desert. Yet with brilliance came shadows. Not everyone celebrated the rise of Timbuktu. Its growing influence alarmed rival powers. Some saw Mali's intellectual wealth as a threat to their own authority. Others coveted the city's libraries, imagining them as treasures waiting to be seized. The more Timbuktu's fame spread, the more it attracted attention from outsiders who understood the profound power of ideas. But in Musa's lifetime, the city remained protected under his vast, prosperous empire. Few dared challenge him. His command of the region's trade routes, combined with his near-unparalleled wealth, ensured Mali's borders remained secure. For a time, Timbuktu stood as an oasis of peace in a world where peace was rare. Still, Musa sensed the fragility of greatness. He knew that wealth could be stolen, that power could shift overnight, that political alliances could crumble like dry mud walls. But knowledge, if preserved, could survive storms that toppled kingdoms. And so, he poured resources into the one thing he believed would withstand time itself: manuscripts. Families who had guarded knowledge for generations found themselves supported by royal patronage. Copyists worked tirelessly, producing duplicates that ensured no idea lived in only a single fragile book. Scholars traveled to collect texts from faraway lands. And thus, Timbuktu's intellectual treasury grew, not through conquest, but through devotion. This was Mansa Musa's legacy, and perhaps his greatest achievement. Yet, even as the city flourished, he could not control how others saw it. News of Timbuktu's riches, golden and intellectual, spread far beyond Africa. In Europe, where explorers and cartographers hungered for tales of wealth across the sea, the idea of a golden city in the desert blurred into myth. Timbuktu became exaggerated, romanticized, and eventually targeted. Musa never intended to create a legend that would draw danger, but once unleashed, stories have a way of shifting destiny. When Musa died, the empire mourned not just the passing of a king, but the end of an era. His successors would struggle to maintain the unity and prosperity he had created. Outside forces would grow bolder, eyeing the treasures he had nurtured. The city he built into a sanctuary for ideas would face challenges darker than anything he had imagined. But in the quiet spaces of Sankor, in the libraries he strengthened, in the manuscripts he inspired families to protect, Musa's vision lived on. His belief in the transformative power of knowledge would become the soul of Timbuktu, a soul that would resist destruction again and again across centuries. What Musa built was more than a city. It was a promise that knowledge, once awakened, could outlive empires. Long before historians crowned him the richest man who ever lived, before his name passed into legend as a symbol of almost unimaginable wealth, Mansa Musa was something far more complex and far more human. He was a ruler shaped by faith, ambition, and an abiding belief that greatness was measured not merely by gold, but by what one left behind. When he ascended to the throne of the Mali Empire in the early 14th century, he inherited a vast realm of forests, rivers, and caravan cities. But what he envisioned for his empire was greater still, a civilization illuminated by knowledge. To understand his impact on Timbuktu, you must imagine him not as a distant monarch seated on a throne, but as a man who saw the world with hungry, curious eyes. When he traveled, he watched how other kingdoms built their institutions, how they nurtured their scholars, how they preserved the wisdom of the past. He didn't merely observe these things, he absorbed them. And his greatest opportunity to reshape his empire came during the most extraordinary journey of his life, his pilgrimage to Mecca. No account of medieval history describes anything like it. His caravan stretched across miles. Tens of thousands of people, soldiers, attendants, and traders. Camels carried gold dust in leather bags. So much gold that Musa's generosity during his travels disrupted entire economies. In Cairo, the markets trembled under the flood of wealth he released. In the Red Sea ports, stories circulated of a king whose riches exceeded imagination. But what most overlooked was the deeper purpose behind his pilgrimage. Mansa Musa used his journey not only to fulfill his religious obligation, but to study the intellectual and architectural wonders of the Islamic world. He visited great mosques in Cairo and Medina. He sat with scholars whose reputations echoed across continents. He observed universities, libraries, and institutions dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. And in these moments of observation, a conviction formed within him. Mali, too, could become a beacon of learning. Timbuktu, already known for its scholars, could become its shining heart. When Musa returned home, he was no longer simply a wealthy king. He was a visionary on a mission. And with him, he brought something far more valuable than gold. He brought minds. Architects, scholars, poets, calligraphers, theologians, men whose talents would help reshape Timbuktu into one of the greatest intellectual capitals of its age. Among them was perhaps the most famous, the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq Saheli, whose elegant designs would influence West African architecture for generations. Under Musa's patronage, Timbuktu transformed. Mosques were rebuilt with grandeur and intention. The Sankor complex expanded, shaped into an institution that rivaled the great learning centers of the Mediterranean and Middle East. Libraries multiplied. Manuscripts poured into the city from all corners of the known world. And scholars, brilliant, restless, curious scholars, followed one another like migrating birds seeking a warmer climate for the mind. To the people of Timbuktu, Musa's investment was not merely a royal project. It was a cultural awakening. Students who once studied in modest courtyards now found themselves in spaces with beautifully carved wooden beams, intricate geometric patterns, and open-air classrooms capable of hosting hundreds. Families who had guarded their manuscripts for generations now had even more incentive to preserve, copy, and expand their collections. Knowledge, once flowing steadily, began to surge. It would be easy to imagine Musa as a distant benefactor, removed from the daily life of the city. But he was far more involved. Chronicles describe him visiting scholars, listening to debates, asking questions. He sought counsel not only from military leaders, but from jurists, philosophers, and astronomers. In an age where many rulers feared intellectual challenge, Musa embraced it. He saw knowledge as a stabilizing force, a foundation upon which his empire could flourish long after he was gone. And it worked. Under Mansa Musa, Timbuktu entered its golden age. The city thrummed with intellectual energy. Caravans arrived from North Africa carrying manuscripts instead of mere goods. Students traveled from distant lands, knowing that a degree earned in Timbuktu carried prestige recognized across the Islamic world. The teachings born in Musa's Timbuktu shaped legal practices, influenced trade policies, and echoed in theological debates far from the desert. Yet with brilliance came shadows. Not everyone celebrated the rise of Timbuktu. Its growing influence alarmed rival powers. Some saw Mali's intellectual wealth as a threat to their own authority. Others coveted the city's libraries, imagining them as treasures waiting to be seized. The more Timbuktu's fame spread, the more it attracted attention from outsiders who understood the profound power of ideas. But in Musa's lifetime, the city remained protected under his vast, prosperous empire. Few dared challenge him. His command of the region's trade routes, combined with his near-unparalleled wealth, ensured Mali's borders remained secure. For a time, Timbuktu stood as an oasis of peace in a world where peace was rare. Still, Musa sensed the fragility of greatness. He knew that wealth could be stolen, that power could shift overnight, that political alliances could crumble like dry mud walls. But knowledge, if preserved, could survive storms that toppled kingdoms. And so, he poured resources into the one thing he believed would withstand time itself: manuscripts. Families who had guarded knowledge for generations found themselves supported by royal patronage. Copyists worked tirelessly, producing duplicates that ensured no idea lived in only a single fragile book. Scholars traveled to collect texts from faraway lands. And thus, Timbuktu's intellectual treasury grew, not through conquest, but through devotion. This was Mansa Musa's legacy, and perhaps his greatest achievement. Yet, even as the city flourished, he could not control how others saw it. News of Timbuktu's riches, golden and intellectual, spread far beyond Africa. In Europe, where explorers and cartographers hungered for tales of wealth across the sea, the idea of a golden city in the desert blurred into myth. Timbuktu became exaggerated, romanticized, and eventually targeted. Musa never intended to create a legend that would draw danger, but once unleashed, stories have a way of shifting destiny. When Musa died, the empire mourned not just the passing of a king, but the end of an era. His successors would struggle to maintain the unity and prosperity he had created. Outside forces would grow bolder, eyeing the treasures he had nurtured. The city he built into a sanctuary for ideas would face challenges darker than anything he had imagined. But in the quiet spaces of Sankor, in the libraries he strengthened, in the manuscripts he inspired families to protect, Musa's vision lived on. His belief in the transformative power of knowledge would become the soul of Timbuktu, a soul that would resist destruction again and again across centuries. What Musa built was more than a city. It was a promise that knowledge, once awakened, could outlive empires. For every place that rises through the power of ideas, there are always those who fear them. Timbuktu was no exception. As its scholars deepened their craft, as its manuscripts traveled farther, and as its influence grew beyond what any desert city was expected to achieve, whispers of unease began to stir among those who valued control above enlightenment. These men, ranging from distant monarchs to regional warlords, from religious hardliners to ambitious foreign explorers, watched Timbuktu with a mixture of fascination and dread. They feared not its armies, for Timbuktu had none worth mentioning. They feared not its wealth, though its gold trade was envied. What unsettled them was far more subtle, the autonomy of its intellect. The city thought for itself. The scholars debated freely. Its students questioned ideas openly. Knowledge flowed across its courtyards like water, unregulated by rulers or priests. To any power built on hierarchy, this was dangerous. In faraway courts, rulers heard rumors of Timbuktu's scholars interpreting law in ways that empowered ordinary people. They heard of jurists who believed justice should be rooted in equity, not obedience. They heard of philosophers who argued that a ruler's worth came not from bloodlines but from wisdom and moral conduct. Such ideas, harmless in theory, could inspire unrest. They could weaken authoritarian structures. They could invite alternative visions of leadership. And for those accustomed to absolute rule, that was unacceptable. Closer to home, regional warlords saw Timbuktu's intellectual authority as a challenge to their dominance. They governed through fear and military strength, not through learning. A city that revered scholarship over the sword threatened their legitimacy. They worried that merchants and tribes under their influence might begin looking to Timbuktu not just for trade, but for guidance. If ideas from the city spread too widely, they could undermine the warlords' fragile alliances and expose their brutality. Even religious hardliners, both within and beyond West Africa, viewed the city with suspicion. Sankor was a place of open theological debate. Scholars engaged with texts from multiple schools of thought. They explored interpretations others deemed too flexible, too mystical, or too innovative. Though deeply rooted in Islamic scholarship, Timbuktu's intellectual climate embraced nuance and complexity. There were no thought police, no rigid enforcement of orthodoxy. For some, this openness represented a corruption of purity. For others, it hinted at heresy. Fanatics whispered that Timbuktu was becoming too bold, too independent, too comfortable in its intellectual freedom. But the greatest threat came from those who looked upon the city with ambition rather than fear, foreign powers seeking expansion. To them, Timbuktu's wealth and scholarship represented opportunity. The gold attracted them first, always the gold. But as stories grew of endless libraries, of thousands of manuscripts stored in private homes, of scholars whose teachings influenced vast regions, their envy sharpened into greed. Ideas were valuable. Libraries could be seized. Scholars could be controlled. Knowledge could be repurposed to strengthen an empire. Among these watchers were explorers who disguised their intentions behind curiosity and diplomacy. They arrived with smiles, studied the libraries, questioned the scholars, and returned home with exaggerated tales. Tales that only fed their leaders' hunger. Others arrived not with books, but with weapons hidden beneath their robes. They observed the city's defenses, calculated its vulnerabilities, and imagined how easily it could be taken. The scholars of Timbuktu sensed this storm long before it broke. They felt the shift in the tone of visitors. They noticed how some guests listened not to learn, but to measure. They recognized eyes that wandered too long over shelves of manuscripts, calculating their worth. The guardians of knowledge, those families who had protected manuscripts for centuries, grew uneasy. They whispered among themselves in the courtyards, wondering how much longer their city would remain safe. Yet what unsettled them most was not the outside world. It was the growing presence of certain factions within their own region who believed that knowledge should serve power, not truth. Men who called themselves reformers but operated like tyrants. Men who cloaked their ambitions in religious righteousness, insisting that scholarship should remain under their supervision. These men saw Timbuktu's independence as a threat that had to be neutralized. Their reasoning was simple. If you control knowledge, you control the people. And if you control the people, you control the land. So the pressure on Timbuktu grew slowly at first, then more aggressively. Rival leaders attempted to impose taxes on scholars traveling to the city. Certain rulers demanded political allegiance from its intellectual elite. Some warlords tried to block caravans, choking the flow of manuscripts and students. A few went further, attempting to recruit scholars to legitimize their rule, only to be rejected with quiet, unwavering dignity. Timbuktu stood firm, not through force, but through resilience. Its scholars reminded their students that knowledge was a trust from God, not a tool for oppression. They emphasized humility, justice, and the pursuit of truth. But they also knew that ideals could not shield them from armies. And those armies were coming closer. In the desert nights, as the wind swept sand across rooftops like restless spirits, families gathered around their manuscripts with a renewed sense of urgency. They strengthened shelves, reinforced hidebound covers, wrapped precious texts in layers of cloth, and whispered prayers over them. Some buried manuscripts in clay jars beneath their homes. Others sent duplicates to trusted allies along distant trade routes. A few began preparing escape plans. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that knowledge has always attracted danger. And yet, even as shadows lengthened, Timbuktu's scholars refused to be silent. They continued teaching, continued debating, continued copying manuscripts line by line. Perhaps they sensed that the coming storm would not merely test their city, it would define it. Because there are moments in history when knowledge stands at the edge of a blade. Moments when the very act of thinking freely becomes a form of resistance. Timbuktu was approaching such a moment. And the men who feared knowledge, the ones who believed ideas should bow before power, were preparing to make their move. The desert, ancient and watchful, felt the tension in the air. Caravans carried whispers darker than gold dust. The winds carried omens. Something was coming, and when it arrived, Timbuktu would never be the same again. The invasion did not begin with a trumpet blast or a declaration of war. It began with a change in the wind, subtle at first, then undeniable. Rumors spread across the Sahara like cracks forming in ice. Caravans arriving from the north whispered of soldiers marching under a foreign banner, of muskets gleaming beneath the sun, of an army unlike anything the Western Sudan had ever seen. The Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, ambitious and calculating, had set his sights on the wealth of the Mali Empire. The gold mattered, yes, but there was something else, something he never admitted openly. He knew of Timbuktu's scholars, its manuscripts, its intellectual prestige. Some believed he craved the knowledge contained in the desert libraries just as much as he craved the gold that enriched his coffers. To control Timbuktu was to control not only trade routes but minds. And so, he dispatched an expeditionary force led by a Spanish-born eunuch general known as Juder Pasha. His soldiers did not resemble the warriors of the Sahel. They carried muskets, long, heavy firearms that spat thunder and smoke. They wore armor that reflected sunlight like shards of glass. And they marched with a precision foreign to the drifting rhythms of desert life. Their path led inevitably southward, toward the Niger River, toward Timbuktu. For the people of Mali, the threat was unimaginable. Never had gunpowder been used against them. Their warriors fought with spears, bows, and courage, but courage alone could not stop bullets. When the two forces met at the Battle of Tondabai in 1591, the outcome was sealed before the first shot was fired. The thunder of muskets shattered the air. Horses panicked. Men fell in heaps. A kingdom that had once stretched across thousands of miles watched its army dissolve under the force of a weapon it had never seen. After Tondabai, nothing stood between Juder Pasha and Timbuktu. The city that had thrived on knowledge and trade now waited in dread. Scholars walked through its narrow streets in tense silence, their robes brushing against walls that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Families began hiding manuscripts behind clay walls, beneath floorboards, inside tightly sealed chests. Some buried their most precious texts in the desert, praying that the shifting dunes would conceal them. Others entrusted their manuscripts to nomadic allies who carried them deep into the Sahara. But the invasion was inevitable. On the day the Moroccan army entered Timbuktu, the sky felt heavy, as if the desert itself mourned. Witnesses later described the scene. A long column of soldiers moving with mechanical precision, muskets slung across their shoulders, armor clinking softly. They marched past the mud-brick mosques and the quiet courtyards where students once recited poetry and debated law. The city did not resist. How could it? Against gunpowder, resistance meant slaughter. Judar Pasha walked with cold detachment, his eyes scanning the streets not for gold, but for signs of authority, influence, and potential rebellion. He knew knowledge, and those who possessed it could be dangerous. So his first orders were not about trade or taxation. They were about control. He summoned the city's leading scholars to appear before him. They came reluctantly, robes dusty, faces etched with exhaustion and fear. These men were not warriors. They had spent their lives with books, not blades. Yet now they stood before a conqueror who had little interest in the value of their minds. Judar demanded their allegiance. Many hesitated, not because they wished to rebel, but because pledging loyalty meant accepting foreign domination over a city whose identity had always been rooted in intellectual independence. Their hesitation was mistaken for defiance. Punishment followed swiftly. Some scholars were imprisoned. Others were exiled to Morocco, never to return. A few disappeared entirely. The loss was immeasurable. Timbuktu had endured hardships before, but never had its heart, its scholars, been targeted with such precision. Then came the search for manuscripts. Soldiers went door to door, demanding to see what families kept hidden. Some households complied, believing that showing harmless texts might spare them. Others refused, risking death rather than surrendering their heritage. Many lied, claiming their libraries were small or insignificant. The Moroccan soldiers, untrained in the value of manuscripts, often overlooked cleverly concealed collections. Still, countless texts were seized, piled into wagons, and transported north. Many were lost along the way. Others were damaged, sold, or forgotten. The invasion did not destroy Timbuktu in a single night, but it wounded it deeply. Its intellectual networks fractured. Students fled. Teachers went into hiding. The vibrant debates that once filled the courtyards faded into silence. The mosques stood unchanged, but the spirit within them dimmed. The city that had once been a lighthouse of knowledge now struggled to keep its flame alive. Yet even in the darkest moments, the desert held secrets the invaders could not see. Not all manuscripts were found. Not all knowledge was stolen. The guardians had been preparing for years, long before the first musket was fired. Their hidden chests, false walls, buried jars, and secret rooms. These became sanctuaries for the knowledge that survived. Families who had once copied manuscripts now protected them like endangered children. Some carried their texts into the desert under cover of night, trusting the vastness of the Sahara more than the walls of their homes. Judar Pasha ruled Timbuktu with an iron fist, but he could never fully grasp the essence of the city he conquered. Power, to him, was visible guns, soldiers, gold. He failed to understand that Timbuktu's true strength had always been invisible. Its knowledge flowed through memory, through recitation, through networks of scholars who refused to let ideas die even when their books were seized. As months turned into years, the Moroccan occupation weakened. Internal conflicts, logistical strains, and the harsh realities of ruling a distant land drained their grip. But the damage had been done. The golden age of Timbuktu was over. Yet what survived, what endured, was remarkable. The manuscripts that escaped detection became a silent rebellion, a quiet defiance, a promise that knowledge, once written, cannot be easily erased. The desert, ancient and impartial, watched as conquerors came and went. Empires rose and fell. Armies marched and vanished. But the manuscripts, the fragile pages filled with ink and devotion, endured. Their survival was not a miracle. It was a choice made by ordinary families who refused to let time or tyranny silence their heritage. And as the Moroccan soldiers eventually faded into history, the manuscripts remained hidden, waiting for the moment they could reemerge, waiting for the next chapter of the city that refused to forget. Because although the invasion shattered Timbuktu's peace, it did not extinguish its soul. It only proved how powerful the written word truly was. In the aftermath of the Moroccan invasion, Timbuktu became a city holding its breath. The streets that once echoed with the soft murmur of lessons and the rhythmic turning of manuscript pages now felt hollow, as if the wind itself mourned. Scholars had been taken, families threatened, libraries raided. Yet despite the fear that seeped into every courtyard and alleyway, something remarkable happened in the shadows of the city's despair. A quiet, determined rescue began. It did not start with a grand plan or a heroic proclamation. It began in small rooms lit by trembling lanterns, where families gathered around collections that had survived generations. They knew the Moroccan soldiers feared rebellion, but they did not understand the true treasure of Timbuktu. To the invaders, manuscripts were curiosities, objects of potential value, symbols of influence. But to the people of the city, they were ancestors, living voices, sacred trust. So the first act of resistance was simple: protect the manuscripts at all costs. Mothers wrapped precious pages in layers of cloth, using garments once passed down as dowries. Fathers sealed manuscripts in carved wooden chests, their hands shaking not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. Children, barely old enough to write their own names, helped hide books behind loose bricks or underneath woven mats. Knowledge had always been communal in Timbuktu. Now, its survival demanded that the entire community act as guardians. As soldiers patrolled the streets, searching homes and demanding compliance, the people quietly worked against them. Some families created false libraries, decoy shelves filled with less valuable texts. Others buried manuscripts beneath their floors, then covered the disturbed earth with rugs or pottery to conceal any trace. A few brave souls even smuggled manuscripts through the city's gates, slipping past guards under the cover of night. The desert became their ally. Families who owned camels loaded manuscripts into bundles disguised as grain or textiles. At night, they left the city in silence, traveling along familiar tracks until the lights of Timbuktu disappeared behind them. Then, beneath a sky thick with stars, they buried their texts in deep pits, placing rocks carefully over the sand to avoid detection. Some went farther, hiding manuscripts in caves where cool air and darkness offered better protection than any home could provide. The secrecy was absolute. A single careless word could condemn an entire family. The Moroccans were not always cruel, but they were unpredictable, and they were desperate to assert control. Any sign of disobedience was taken as rebellion. So the silent rescue unfolded in whispers, glances, hand gestures, an unspoken agreement across the city. Some of the most extraordinary efforts came from the families who had inherited the largest private libraries. These were the guardians whose ancestors had copied manuscripts for centuries, filling chests with texts on law, astronomy, medicine, theology, mathematics, and poetry. Their homes had once been havens for learning. Now they were vaults of hidden heritage. To protect their collections, they innovated quickly and fearlessly. One family sealed dozens of manuscripts inside clay jars, then lowered them into a dry well behind their home. Another hid texts in an attic accessible only through a narrow crawlspace. Some trusted their manuscripts to friends beyond the city, merchants, nomads, or desert guides who carried them deep into the Sahara, wrapped tightly against the sand. But the rescue was not only physical, it was mental. Scholars who remained in the city memorized passages from the manuscripts before hiding them. Some learned entire treatises by heart, ensuring that even if the pages were lost, the ideas would survive. Students whispered lessons to one another, passing knowledge like smuggled treasure. Teachers taught in secret, gathering only a few trusted pupils at a time, sharing what they could without leaving written traces. Meanwhile, the Moroccan authorities struggled to understand the city they had conquered. They found gold, yes. They found salt. They found trade routes. But they could not grasp the deeper currents that made Timbuktu unique. They seized manuscripts without understanding which texts held real value. They imprisoned scholars without knowing how many others continued teaching in secret. They tried to stop the flow of ideas without realizing that ideas do not stop. They adapt, travel, hide, survive. It was during this period that the legend of Timbuktu's library families truly formed. Their bravery was not loud or dramatic. It was deliberate, patient, quiet. They did not wield weapons. They wielded foresight. Every decision they made, even mistakes, was rooted in the belief that knowledge must endure even when cities fall. And slowly, over months and years, a network emerged. Families sent quiet messages to one another, sharing news of safe hiding places and warning of dangerous patrols. When one home was searched, another family might temporarily take its manuscripts. When someone died unexpectedly, trusted friends ensured the manuscripts they protected were not left vulnerable. It was an unspoken pact that bound the people of Timbuktu together in a way no conqueror could ever break. The silent rescue did not save every manuscript. Many were lost, taken, or destroyed. But thousands, tens of thousands, survived because ordinary people refused to surrender what they valued most. When the Moroccan occupation weakened, when the soldiers finally began losing interest or returning north, the manuscripts were unearthed again. Pulled from wells, carried back from desert caves, retrieved from chests where they had waited in darkness. Families brushed dust from their covers, whispered prayers of gratitude, and returned them to their shelves like long-lost relatives. Timbuktu had been wounded, but it had not been robbed of its soul. The silent rescue had not just preserved manuscripts. It had preserved identity, memory, and hope. It had proven that knowledge does not belong to empires, but to the people who believe in it. And as the desert winds continued to sweep the city's rooftops, the guardians understood something profound. They had survived the first attempt to erase their heritage. But more storms would come. And their mission, their sacred duty, was far from over. The survival of Timbuktu's manuscripts did not depend on fortresses or armies. It depended on something far stranger, far more ingenious: the art of being invisible. In a city that outsiders imagined as a golden beacon, the most precious treasures lived not in grand halls, but in ordinary homes, concealed in ways so subtle that even a careful intruder could walk past them without ever knowing what lay a few feet away. After the Moroccan invasion, concealment became not only a habit, it became a way of life. To anyone wandering through Timbuktu after the conquest, the city looked unchanged. The same narrow alleys wound between sun-baked walls. The same carved wooden doors opened into shaded courtyards. The same mosques stood tall, their minarets rising like humble monuments to faith. But beneath this appearance of normalcy, a quiet transformation was underway. Entire families became guardians of hidden libraries so seamlessly concealed that even their neighbors sometimes had no idea what secrets lay within. A visitor stepping into one of these homes might see nothing unusual at first glance. A small sitting area, a mat spread over the floor, simple pottery arranged neatly, a shelf with a few modest books. But behind that shelf, behind those walls of mud and straw, behind clay bricks placed centuries earlier, lived hundreds of manuscripts carefully arranged in secret chambers. These chambers were not built for luxury. They were built to deceive. The walls were thick enough to mask temperature changes. The entrances were disguised to blend perfectly with the surrounding architecture. A stranger could knock on the wall and hear nothing but solid earth. Some families created false rooms, small storage spaces deliberately cluttered with everyday objects: cooking pots, grain baskets, old garments. Behind these decoy rooms, hidden doorways led to the real treasure: manuscripts wrapped in layers of cloth, stacked neatly inside chests that had been reinforced to endure time, insects, and desert heat. To access these secret spaces, one had to know exactly where to press. One loose brick, one disguised notch in the wooden beam, one tile that shifted just slightly when stepped upon. Even homes that looked poor from the outside often concealed incredible wealth within. A mud hut with a cracked doorway could hold a collection of legal texts worth more than any gold dust. A simple courtyard with a lone acacia tree might hide a chamber filled with treatises on astronomy and medicine. The concealment was deliberate. To protect knowledge, families sometimes made their homes appear humbler than they truly were. The less attention they attracted, the safer the manuscripts. But hiding texts within the city was only one part of the strategy. Some families took concealment even further, using Timbuktu itself, the city's very structure, as a shield. Manuscripts were placed inside mosque walls, hidden beneath wooden floorboards in prayer halls, or tucked inside columns that supported roofs. Worshippers would pray above these secret chambers every day without knowing the sacred knowledge resting beneath them. In some mosques, the imams acted as collaborators in the concealment, guiding families to places where manuscripts could remain untouched for decades. Other hiding places were even more unexpected. Some manuscripts were stored inside clay pots and buried beneath henna gardens or beneath the sand in courtyards where children played. A soldier searching such a home might see only dust and dried leaves, unaware that the ground beneath his feet held a centuries-old mathematical treatise written by hands long gone. In one house, the manuscripts were hidden inside hollow wooden pillars. In another, they were sealed in leather satchels and hung high in dark rafters, disguised as old farming tools. But perhaps the most remarkable concealment was not physical, it was psychological. The people of Timbuktu perfected the art of appearing unthreatening. When soldiers came to question them, they feigned ignorance. They pretended to possess only a few humble books. They spoke modestly, offered tea, smiled politely, and made their homes seem uninspired and ordinary. What the conquerors did not understand was that within these calm faces lived a fierce determination. The people of Timbuktu knew how to hide their brilliance behind an expression of quiet humility. They knew how to conceal fear behind hospitality. They knew how to preserve secrets beneath stillness. Over time, the Moroccan conquerors grew complacent. They believed they had taken what mattered: gold, trade, territory. They believed the city was subdued. They never suspected that the real treasure had slipped past their grasp long before they arrived. What the soldiers saw as the fading glory of a conquered city was, in truth, a carefully maintained illusion. But even with the most intricate hiding places, the manuscripts were never completely safe. Danger lingered in unpredictable forms: floods, termites, the relentless desert climate, and human betrayal. A single misstep, a misplaced word, a careless child revealing too much, a door left open at the wrong moment, could expose an entire library. Families lived with this fear constantly. Night after night, they whispered warnings to their children. Day after day, they reinforced walls, checked hiding places, and memorized the positions of every manuscript. Despite the risks, the manuscripts were never abandoned. Even those hidden in the most remote or dangerous places were visited regularly. Guardians would sneak into concealed rooms late at night to clean, dust, and inspect the pages. They rewrote damaged manuscripts by lamplight, copying each letter with painstaking accuracy. They repaired crumbling bindings using materials they scavenged from old garments or worn-out leather satchels. Every act of preservation was a ritual of devotion. The survival of the manuscripts depended not on a single heroic act, but on thousands of small, consistent, silent acts carried out across generations. It depended on ordinary people willing to take extraordinary risks. It depended on families whose names were rarely recorded but whose actions shaped the course of intellectual history. Through their sacrifices, a new truth emerged. Knowledge does not need grand temples to endure. It needs hearts willing to protect it, even when the world outside is collapsing. And so, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in darkness and dust, shielded by walls that others saw as unremarkable, Timbuktu's manuscripts endured. They waited patiently, like sleeping giants, for the moment they could rise again. Because the families who hid them understood something profound. A manuscript can be taken. A library can be burned. A scholar can be exiled. But knowledge that has been protected with love, knowledge that has survived by becoming invisible, never truly disappears. Long before Europeans ever set foot in Timbuktu, the city already lived in their imaginations. For generations, stories drifted back across the Mediterranean. Stories carried by merchants who had survived the Sahara. Stories embroidered by awe and uncertainty. Stories that made Timbuktu sound like a place untouched by the ordinary rules of the world. A city overflowing with gold. A city where scholars outnumbered soldiers. A city whose libraries held secrets older than kingdoms. For European courts, hungry for new territories and desperate for symbols of prestige, these rumors were intoxicating. They painted Timbuktu as a riddle wrapped in wealth, a mystery that begged to be solved. And as the Renaissance awakened a renewed appetite for exploration, curiosity hardened into obsession. The first wave of European interest came quietly. Cartographers marked Timbuktu on their maps long before anyone had seen it. The name appeared like a promise of something exotic, something valuable. Kings questioned their ambassadors. Scholars speculated about the manuscripts rumored to be stored there. Sailors whispered about gold dust so plentiful it coated the streets like sand. But these early impressions were born of distance and misunderstanding. In Europe, where African civilizations were seldom acknowledged as equal, the idea of a sophisticated intellectual hub in the desert was incomprehensible. To reconcile this contradiction, Europeans created myths. Some imagined Timbuktu as a city of towering palaces paved with gold. Others insisted it was a lost kingdom, a relic of ancient grandeur. Few believed it was a living, breathing center of scholarship. And yet, the stories persisted, growing more elaborate with every retelling. By the 18th century, the obsession became something sharper. European powers, France, Britain, Spain, each wanted to be the first to reach Timbuktu, the first to unlock its treasures, the first to claim its knowledge. Explorers were recruited, financed, trained. But reaching Timbuktu was no simple task. The Sahara devoured unprepared men with indifference. Many vanished. Some turned back. Those who tried to disguise themselves as Muslim pilgrims often knew too little of the culture to pass undetected. Still, the obsession intensified. There were maps drawn from hearsay, letters written based on rumors, speculations so dramatic they bordered on fiction. Timbuktu was no longer just a city. It was an idea, a symbol of the unknown. For European intellectuals, it represented a frontier of enlightenment. For conquerors, it represented opportunity. For the curious, it represented mystery. For the ambitious, it represented glory. But beneath the myth, something more complex was unfolding. European interest was not driven solely by rumors of gold. It was driven by a growing awareness that Timbuktu held manuscripts, thousands of them. Manuscripts that predated European exploration. Manuscripts filled with philosophy, mathematics, cosmology, medicine, jurisprudence, poetry, and more. These texts suggested a history of intellectual achievement that did not fit neatly into European narratives about Africa. They hinted at a continent far more literate, organized, and intellectually sophisticated than colonial ideologies allowed. And that idea was deeply unsettling. For if Timbuktu held advanced scientific and philosophical works, then much of what Europe believed about Africa was false. Entire hierarchies, entire justifications for conquest and domination, risked unraveling. This tension fueled a second wave of European obsession, one driven not by curiosity, but by fear. To maintain control over their narratives, some European thinkers insisted the manuscripts must be exaggerated. Others argued the texts had foreign origins, that Africans merely stored them, but did not write them. A few admitted the truth but attempted to minimize its significance. These debates raged in scholarly circles long before Europeans ever reached Timbuktu. Meanwhile, in the desert, caravans carried whisper after whisper. "They are coming," the traders said. "The Europeans want what Morocco could not take." But the journey remained lethal. Sandstorms swallowed caravans without warning. Bandits lurked in the dunes. Heat exhaustion claimed men who underestimated the desert's patience. Many who set out for Timbuktu never returned. Their journals, recovered months or years later, became cautionary tales that paradoxically made the city even more alluring. Then came the explorers, men whose names would be etched into the strange intersection of curiosity and conquest. Some, like René Cayley, approached with cunning and caution, disguising themselves as Muslim travelers and earning trust slowly. Others arrived brashly, loudly proclaiming their intentions only to be met with suspicion and danger. A few perished on the way, their dreams buried in the sand alongside their ambitions. Those who reached Timbuktu rarely found what they expected. The city was not made of gold. It was made of simplicity. Mud brick homes, wooden doors, narrow streets carved by time and wind. To explorers expecting grandeur, the physical appearance disappointed. But then they saw the manuscripts. The libraries, the scholars, the intellectual gatherings that persisted even through hardship. Slowly, they realized that Timbuktu's wealth was not glittering but luminous, not material but intellectual. European reactions varied wildly. Some were humbled. They admitted their preconceptions had been shattered. They wrote about Timbuktu's scholarship with admiration and respect, praising its teachers and marveling at its libraries. Others reacted defensively. Unable to reconcile the city's intellectual depth with their own biases, they claimed the manuscripts were imports, not creations. They argued the African scholars had simply preserved knowledge from elsewhere. They minimized Timbuktu's contributions, twisting its brilliance into something that fit their worldview. Yet the manuscripts themselves told the truth. They contained original commentary, innovative synthesis, and distinctly West African ideas. They proved that Timbuktu was not merely a receiver of knowledge, it was a producer of it, a shaper, a contributor to global thought. And this truth frightened many Europeans far more than any golden treasure ever could. For if ideas had been thriving in West Africa long before European explorers arrived, then Europe was not the sole torchbearer of enlightenment. Timbuktu's intellectual heritage challenged the foundation of colonial ideology. And in doing so, it became something European powers desperately wanted to claim or control. Their obsession grew into a scramble to obtain manuscripts, study them, own them. Some explorers purchased texts from families unaware of their growing global value. Others stole manuscripts outright. A few simply copied passages into their journals, bringing fragments of Timbuktu's intellectual history back across the sea. But even as manuscripts left the city, they carried with them something Europeans did not expect. A reminder that knowledge thrives where it is valued, not where it is recognized. The more Europe studied Timbuktu, the more threatened it became by what the city represented. A civilization built not on conquest, but on scholarship. A legacy that undermined centuries of prejudice. A truth that refused to be silenced. And so the European obsession continued, feeding itself on equal parts admiration, envy, and denial. Because Timbuktu was no longer just a city. It was a mirror, one that reflected truths many were not prepared to see. For centuries, Europe dreamt of Timbuktu without truly believing it existed. The city lived in rumor, in imagination, in the margins of maps where cartographers wrote strange creatures and impossible wonders. Scholars spoke its name with fascination. Kings whispered it with greed. Yet until the early 19th century, not a single European had walked openly through its gates and returned alive to tell the story. When Europe finally saw Timbuktu, the world shifted. It began not with fanfare, but with a quiet man walking into the city disguised as a traveler, a wanderer, a pilgrim. His name was René Cailly, a French explorer driven less by glory and more by curiosity, a curiosity so fierce it bordered on defiance. He spent years studying Islam, learning languages, memorizing prayers, and acclimating himself to desert life. He understood what so many European explorers did not. Timbuktu would reveal itself only to those who approached with humility, not arrogance. By the time he crossed the final dunes and saw the city rising from the horizon, sunlit walls of mud brick glowing like burnished copper, he felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. He had made it. He was alive. And Europe's most persistent mystery was no longer a rumor. Stood before him real, tangible, quiet. But what he saw stunned him. The mythical city of gold was not paved in shimmering metal. There were no towering palaces or jeweled gates. Instead, Timbuktu appeared humble. Simple dwellings, narrow lanes, earthen mosques with wooden beams protruding like ribs. To Cailly, it seemed strangely peaceful, almost subdued. And yet, under this calm surface, something extraordinary stirred. Inside homes that looked modest from the outside were libraries filled with manuscripts older than European kingdoms. In courtyards shaded from the unforgiving sun, scholars gathered in circles, debating philosophy with a confidence that revealed centuries of intellectual training. Markets buzzed not only with trade, but with the exchange of ideas. And in the mosques, teachers delivered lessons that resonated with sophistication, nuance, and depth. Cayley wrote in his journal that Timbuktu was a place of great renown, but he also admitted he had expected something physically grander. He didn't yet understand that Timbuktu's wealth could not be measured in buildings. Its treasures were not crafted from stone, they were written on paper. His observations, simple as they seemed, sent shockwaves through Europe. Because while Cayley was the first to return alive, he was not the first to attempt the journey. Many others had perished in the desert, leaving only fragments of journals, fading maps, and incomplete testimonies. Europe had lost centuries chasing a mirage, and now the truth was in front of them. Not glittering, but radiant in a way they had never imagined. The manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them, scientific treatises, medical texts, philosophical arguments, legal documents, poetry, astronomical charts, mystical writings, page after page of knowledge preserved by families who had withstood invasions, droughts, and political upheaval. These manuscripts, handwritten with meticulous care, proved that Timbuktu was not a city of gold in the physical sense, but something more profound, a city of intellect. When Cayley returned to Europe and presented his findings, reactions were mixed. Some scholars were astonished. They embraced the truth that Africa held sophisticated traditions of learning. They studied the manuscripts with respect, acknowledging their originality and historical significance. They recognized the brilliance of the scholars who had lived and taught in Timbuktu long before Europe experienced its own renaissance. But others reacted with denial. They insisted Cayley must have exaggerated. They claimed the manuscripts were not African in origin, but foreign texts imported from North Africa or the Middle East. They argued that Timbuktu could not have produced such scholarly richness because it contradicted the racial ideologies that underpinned European thought. Their denial was not about ignorance, it was about fear. Fear that the world was far more interconnected than they believed. Fear that Africa had shaped intellectual history in ways they had never acknowledged. Fear that the knowledge housed in Timbuktu's libraries might rewrite narratives that justified conquest and domination. Still, the truth could not be contained. As the 19th century progressed, more Europeans reached the city, explorers, linguists, colonial officers, scholars. Each encountered a version of Timbuktu shaped by their expectations. Some saw poverty and dismissed it. Others saw manuscripts and were mesmerized. A few felt both admiration and discomfort, realizing the city's simplicity masked a depth of sophistication their own societies had refused to recognize. They entered homes expecting modest interiors and instead discovered chests filled with ancient texts. They met families who had preserved their libraries through war and famine. They listened to teachers who spoke with refinement and authority. They walked through markets where merchants quoted poetry and argued about legal theory between bargaining sessions. Europe, accustomed to seeing itself as the world's intellectual center, found its self-image challenged by a desert city whose foundations rested not on empire, but on scholarship. But Timbuktu was also scarred. By the time Europeans arrived, centuries of conflict, including the Moroccan invasion, had weakened its institutions. Some libraries were in decline. Manuscripts had been lost. Scholars had dispersed. The Golden Age was gone, leaving behind fragments of brilliance that hinted at a past far greater than its present reality. And yet, even in decline, Timbuktu's intellectual legacy was unmistakable. European explorers wrote with conflicting emotions: admiration, disbelief, unease. They described the city as both humble and extraordinary, decayed yet powerful, forgotten yet unforgettable. They had not discovered a myth. They had discovered a truth far more complex. Timbuktu was a place where knowledge had once reigned supreme, a testament to a time when ideas traveled across the desert with the same importance as gold. One explorer wrote, "The libraries are immense, the scholars learned, the manuscripts ancient." Another noted that the people spoke with a gentle dignity, as if aware of a history too deep for outsiders to grasp. For Europe, seeing Timbuktu was like looking into a mirror that reflected a version of the world where wisdom was measured not in wealth or expansion, but in ink and parchment. For Africa, the recognition, however reluctant, validated what its people had always known. Their ancestors had built civilizations where learning thrived, where scholars shaped policy, where books were prized above gold. Yet the encounter also marked a turning point. As Europe finally gazed upon Timbuktu's manuscripts, admiration intertwined with ambition. Scholars wanted to study them. Collectors wanted to buy them. Colonizers wanted to control them. The manuscripts, once protected from Moroccan soldiers, now faced a new kind of threat, one motivated not by gunpowder, but by curiosity mixed with entitlement. Timbuktu had revealed itself to the world. But the world was not prepared for what it saw. And while the European gaze illuminated the city in some ways, it also cast long shadows. Shadows that would stretch into the future, influencing how the manuscripts were treated, interpreted, misunderstood, and sometimes stolen. For better or worse, Europe had finally seen Timbuktu, and nothing would be the same again. Misunderstanding can be more destructive than ignorance. Ignorance leaves room for curiosity, for discovery, for possibility. But misunderstanding breeds certainty, the kind of certainty that blinds, distorts, and reshapes truth to fit whatever story the powerful prefer. And when Europeans finally confronted the reality of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage, misunderstanding became their most convenient weapon. To many European scholars and colonial officials, the very existence of a learned African city contradicted the narratives they had built their world upon. In their minds, Africa was a blank space, a place without written history, without philosophical roots, without scientific contributions. A place to be civilized, not recognized. Timbuktu shattered that illusion. Its manuscripts, thousands of them, covering astronomy, medicine, jurisprudence, mathematics, poetry, theology, and more, proved that Africa had been thinking deeply, questioning boldly, and producing knowledge centuries before Europeans ever set foot in its sands. This truth was too large to ignore, and too dangerous to fully accept. So the misunderstanding began with a simple idea, spoken as a shield. These manuscripts must have come from somewhere else. It started softly, whispered in scholarly salons and published between the lines of academic journals. Some Europeans argued that the manuscripts were imports from the Arab world, carried to Timbuktu by traders but not created there. Others insisted the scribes were merely copyists with no original thought. A few went further, claiming the people of the region were incapable of producing such intellectual richness. It was easier to rewrite the origins of the manuscripts than to rewrite centuries of prejudice. This denial was not only academic, it spread into the public imagination. European travel literature painted Timbuktu as a place of faded glory, implying its brilliance had always been borrowed rather than born from the soil of the Sahel. Many writers described the people as custodians of knowledge rather than creators, as if African hands could preserve books but not generate the ideas within them. At the same time, the city's simplicity confused visiting Europeans. They expected marble palaces and golden domes. Instead, they found mud-brick homes and quiet alleyways. They mistook architectural humility for intellectual poverty, overlooking the truth that knowledge in Timbuktu was stored not in grand buildings, but in hearts, minds, and manuscripts scattered across thousands of private homes. These explorers judged the city by what they could see, never realizing that what mattered was precisely what was hidden. But misunderstanding grew sharper when it met ambition. European powers saw opportunity in Timbuktu's manuscripts. They wanted to study them, own them, collect them. Some were motivated by genuine respect, others by the desire to control or display. European museums, libraries, and private collectors began acquiring manuscripts, sometimes through trade, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through theft. Families who had guarded their collections for centuries suddenly faced an unfamiliar kind of danger. The danger of being academically erased. Because the more Europeans studied the manuscripts, the more they struggled with the inconsistencies in their own narratives. How could African scholars describe the motions of stars with such clarity? How could they write legal treatises that showed sophisticated reasoning? How could they produce philosophical work that echoed, challenged, or even predated ideas circulating in European centers of learning? The answers were simple. They had always been capable. They had always been thinkers. But these answers were inconvenient. And so misunderstanding transformed into misrepresentation. Some European scholars selectively interpreted the manuscripts to fit their beliefs. They highlighted sections that matched their expectations and ignored those that challenged them. They mistranslated, exaggerated, minimized, always steering the narrative toward a familiar shape. Yet even as misunderstanding distorted the truth, something else quietly unfolded in the background. The manuscripts themselves refused to lie. Their handwriting showed local styles. Their commentaries referenced local conditions, rains, crops, tribal customs, desert geographies. Their marginal notes revealed debates between African scholars across generations. Their diagrams reflected astronomical observations unique to the Sahel. Some manuscripts even contained genealogies, poems, or teachings written in African languages using Arabic script. Only someone who wanted to misunderstand could deny their origins. Still, the misinterpretation had consequences. European dismissiveness influenced early academic research, shaped public education, and colored how the rest of the world viewed African history. Timbuktu, instead of being celebrated as a center of learning, became a curiosity, a myth, a footnote. Its manuscripts were exoticized rather than understood. Its scholars were forgotten or minimized. This distortion hurt not only the image of Timbuktu, but the memory of an entire intellectual tradition. But misunderstanding could do only so much. Because the people of Timbuktu, the guardians, the scholars, the families whose lifeblood was ink and parchment, knew the truth. They had lived it. They had copied the manuscripts with their own hands, taught their children from them, debated their teachings in open-air courtyards. They knew which manuscripts had been written by local thinkers, which had been imported, which had been expanded, translated, argued over. They knew their history was far richer than foreigners realized. They also knew that misunderstanding, like empires, eventually crumbles. And so they continued, quietly, steadily, defiantly. They taught, they copied, they recited, they preserved. They resisted every attempt to erase or diminish them. Because the city's greatest strength was not that others misunderstood it. It was that Timbuktu understood itself. Even when Europe looked without seeing, judged without understanding, or spoke without listening, Timbuktu's intellectual heritage endured. Misunderstanding may have shaped how the world perceived the city, but it never touched the truth at its core. And beneath the dust of centuries, beneath the weight of external judgment, the manuscripts still waited, patient, intact, powerful. They survived every distortion and every denial. And eventually, they would prove once again that knowledge does not require permission to exist. It only requires guardians. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are often described as treasures, but that word barely scratches the surface. Treasure suggests something static, gold locked in a chest, jewels glittering silently. But these manuscripts are alive. They pulse with intellect, with memory, with centuries of questions and answers stitched into their pages by hands that understood the weight of every letter. To open one is not to read. It is to listen, and what they say changes everything. For generations, scholars approached the manuscripts believing they would find little more than religious treatises or legal documents. But the moment researchers began opening chests sealed for centuries, something astonishing happened. They found a universe, complex, interconnected, advanced far beyond what many historians thought possible for the medieval Sahel. The manuscripts covered subjects so wide in scope that even modern libraries would struggle to categorize them. There were astronomical charts tracking the movement of stars and planets with precision that rivaled European observations of the same era. Some displayed hand-drawn diagrams of lunar phases, solar positions, and sophisticated calculations used to determine prayer times, agricultural cycles, and navigational paths across the desert. They revealed a scientific culture rooted not in guesswork, but in careful observation of the cosmos. A cosmos the desert made impossible to ignore. There were medical texts describing treatments for illnesses ranging from fevers and infections to psychological disturbances. Some detailed the properties of desert herbs, how they should be harvested, dried, and combined. Others described surgical procedures performed with astonishing skill. Sutures, cauterizations, bone-setting techniques. A few even discussed the importance of mental well-being alongside physical health, centuries before psychology emerged as a distinct field in Europe. There were mathematical manuscripts filled with geometric proofs, equations, and applied calculations used for architecture, trade, and land measurement. Some revealed algebraic reasoning reminiscent of scholars in Baghdad or Cordoba, yet adapted beautifully to the needs of West African society. These were not mere copies of foreign works. They contained original commentary, expansions, and innovations shaped by local experiences. There were legal treatises, dense, nuanced, and meticulously argued. They discussed inheritance laws, marriage rights, commercial ethics, political succession, and responsibilities of rulers. Many of these texts blended Islamic jurisprudence with local customs, creating a uniquely West African intellectual tradition grounded in fairness and social equilibrium. These writings show a world where justice was debated not in royal courts, but in open courtyards among scholars committed to truth. And then there was the poetry. Beautiful, haunting poetry written in Arabic and African languages using Arabic script. Verses that spoke of love, exile, longing, the desert's silence, the joy of learning, the pain of loss. The poets of Timbuktu were philosophers as much as artists. They used metaphor to explore the human soul, to question the nature of existence, to seek God in the wind and the sand. But perhaps the most surprising manuscripts were those dealing with metaphysics, mysticism, and esoteric thought. These texts, sometimes cryptic, sometimes luminous, represented a deeper pursuit of understanding. They probed questions about destiny, the unseen world, the nature of the self, and the relationship between material and spiritual realms. Some contained diagrams that appeared almost cosmological in structure, mapping inner states of consciousness. Others explored dream interpretation, spiritual healing, and coded symbolism. For scholars accustomed to rigid distinctions between science, philosophy, and spirituality, these manuscripts were confounding and dazzling. They revealed a worldview in which the rational and the mystical were not enemies, but partners. In Timbuktu's intellectual tradition, to study the stars was also to study the soul. To heal the body was also to align the spirit. To understand law was also to understand morality. But the manuscripts did more than preserve knowledge. They revealed a network, an ancient web of communication that spanned continents. Timbuktu's scholars were not isolated. They corresponded with thinkers in Cairo, Fez, Tunis, and even Persia. Manuscripts moved along trade routes like precious cargo, crossing deserts and seas. A single text copied in Timbuktu might travel to Morocco, be studied by a scholar in Spain, then return decades later in expanded form. This exchange created something remarkable, a global conversation long before the modern world began speaking of globalization. And at the center of this conversation were the scribes. Their handwriting varied from elegant to utilitarian, but every stroke told a story. In the margins, they wrote notes, some clarifying, some questioning, some challenging the text itself. These margin notes became dialogues across time. A scholar in the 1500s might respond to a question written in the margins by someone in the 1400s. Another scholar, a century later, might add a rebuttal or an enhancement. The manuscripts became communities, living debates unfolding across generations. But the most intriguing manuscripts were the ones that defied categorization entirely. Some were hybrids, part scientific observation, part mystical reflection. Others contained puzzles, coded symbols, encrypted messages, numerical sequences whose purposes remain unclear. A few appeared to record philosophical experiments, hypothetical scenarios intended to test moral reasoning or metaphysical principles. One manuscript described the desert as a conscious entity, observing travelers and influencing their fate. Another depicted a system of planetary influence that blended astronomy with spirituality. A third outlined a method for resolving community conflicts using geometric analogies, suggesting that human behavior followed patterns similar to the natural world. The more scholars studied these manuscripts, the more they understood that Timbuktu did not simply collect knowledge, it created it. It synthesized ideas from across the world and reimagined them in ways that fit the realities of West African life. And it did something else. It preserved knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. When Mongol invasions devastated libraries in the East, when wars and fires consumed manuscripts in Europe, when political upheaval destroyed learning centers across the Mediterranean, Timbuktu, against all odds, became a refuge. Texts thought lost in other parts of the world resurfaced in private libraries here, copied carefully by scribes who had no idea they were saving humanity's memory. But the manuscripts also exposed something uncomfortable. History is far larger than the stories we tell about it. They showed that Africa was not a passive continent waiting for discovery. It was an engine of thought, a participant in global intellectual networks, a producer of ideas that shaped the medieval world. They revealed that civilizations rise and fall not only through trade or war, but through the flow of ideas, and that Timbuktu once stood at the heart of that flow. Yet even as the manuscripts dazzled modern researchers, they also carried an aura of sorrow. So many pages had been damaged by time, insects, or conflict. So many volumes had been lost during invasions, burned by extremists, or carried away by collectors who never understood their significance. Each manuscript that survived was a miracle of endurance, a testimony not only to the scholars who wrote it, but to the families who risked everything to keep it safe. When modern scholars held these texts for the first time, they often described the experience with trembling emotion. Some felt awe, some felt grief, some felt shame at how long the world had ignored this legacy. Others felt wonder, pure, breathless wonder, at the realization that the desert had hidden a world of intellect in plain sight. A world that was only now beginning to speak again, because the manuscripts, fragile as they are, hold a power beyond words, a power that whispers from every page. There is more to history than you know, more to Africa than you imagined, more to humanity than the stories you inherited. And those who listen closely may find answers to questions no empire ever thought to ask. The manuscripts of Timbuktu were remarkable not only for their scientific precision or legal sophistication, but for something deeper and far more enigmatic, an intellectual heartbeat woven from Sufi philosophy. To understand Timbuktu without understanding Sufism is to see only half the picture. It was the Sufi spirit, gentle, questioning, inward-looking, that shaped the city's mind, its scholarship, and its sense of purpose. It was the Sufi networks, stretching across continents like invisible threads, that connected Timbuktu to a vast world of ideas. And it was Sufi teachers and mystics who transformed learning into a spiritual journey rather than a purely academic pursuit. To European explorers, the city's simple architecture seemed unremarkable. But inside those humble buildings, Sufi scholars cultivated a worldview so rich, so complex, and so subtle that modern researchers often struggle to grasp its full depth. They taught that knowledge was not merely information but illumination, a light placed within the heart of a seeker. A manuscript was not simply an object. It was a doorway. A classroom was not a place. It was a path, and every path led somewhere beyond the visible world. Many manuscripts contained layers of meaning that only trained initiates could fully understand. A line in a legal commentary might hide a mystical teaching. A seemingly simple poem could contain coded references to spiritual states. Marginal notes often recorded quiet, intimate reflections, personal insights jotted down by scholars who sought truth not only through argument, but through purification of the soul. The Sufi influence flowed into everything. It shaped how scholars approached astronomy, not simply as a study of celestial mechanics, but as a reflection of divine order. The stars were maps, yes, but they were also metaphors. Their movement mirrored the movement of the spirit. Their cycles echoed the cycles of the heart. To chart the heavens was to peer into the architecture of God's creation. It shaped how scholars approached medicine. Healing the body required understanding its systems, but healing the heart required something more. Prayer, meditation, ethical conduct, remembrance. Illness had physical causes, but also emotional and spiritual roots. A physician trained in Timbuktu might prescribe herbs for fever and verses for fear. They saw no contradiction in this. Reality to them was unified. It shaped how scholars approached law. Justice was not merely the application of rules but the restoration of balance. A judge trained in Sufi ethics might consider not only the facts of a dispute but the moral and spiritual implications. The purpose of judgment was to mend relationships, not to punish. But the most profound expression of Sufi influence was found in the manuscripts that explored metaphysics, dreams, cosmology, and the inner world. These works were unlike anything found in most medieval libraries. One manuscript described the human soul as a traveler on a long desert journey, passing through stations of purification the way a caravan passes through oases. Each station brought the seeker closer to self-awareness and to God. Another mapped levels of spiritual perception using geometric shapes. Circles representing states of unity, squares representing the material world, 8-pointed stars symbolizing the balance between seen and unseen. These diagrams were not decorative. They were teaching tools, visual guides to the architecture of existence. Some manuscripts discuss dreams, not in the casual, symbolic way of modern psychology, but with astonishing depth. Dreams were messages from the unseen realm, messages requiring interpretation by someone trained in both spiritual and intellectual disciplines. Certain dreams were warnings, others were maps. Some were confirmations of a seeker's progress. A few, rare and guarded, were believed to be encounters with divine truth. The manuscript tradition also revealed something unusual. Timbuktu scholars were connected to Sufi masters across Africa and beyond. Letters traveled between Timbuktu and Fez, Cairo, Mecca, Sudan, and Andalusia. Teachings flowed along caravan routes. Mystical lineages crossed the desert like veins of light. In these letters, scholars debated not only legal issues or philosophical questions, but spiritual states. How does one distinguish divine inspiration from personal desire? What is the true nature of the heart's mirror, and how does one polish it? Can knowledge be dangerous if pursued without humility? What is the role of silence in discovering truth? These were not abstract questions. They shaped how scholars lived, how they taught, how they wrote. Sufi ethics made Timbuktu's intellectual tradition fundamentally different from many others. It was not confrontational. It did not elevate ego. Knowledge was not a weapon, not a tool for domination. It was a path toward refinement. This spiritual orientation also affected how manuscripts were preserved. To hide a book was not only an act of protection but an act of devotion. To copy a text was not merely labor, it was worship. To memorize a passage was to imprint wisdom onto one's soul. The Sufi worldview made knowledge sacred. And this sacredness produced another unexpected effect: intellectual freedom. Because Sufism valued inner transformation above outward conformity, scholars in Timbuktu often explored ideas that would have been controversial or even forbidden elsewhere. Some manuscripts contain esoteric mathematical theories that hint at symbolic or mystical applications. Others discuss metaphysical cosmologies, blending philosophical inquiry with spiritual insight. A few venture into territory that orthodox scholars might call dangerous: discussions of divine love, ecstatic union, or hidden knowledge granted only to the spiritually awakened. These were not texts for everyone. Many were copied in small numbers, passed quietly from teacher to trusted student. Some were hidden within larger manuscripts, their teachings concealed behind coded symbols or metaphors. And yet they survived. Their survival is astonishing, given how many regimes sought to silence unconventional thought. But the Sufi networks, flexible, decentralized, discrete, made them difficult to extinguish. Knowledge flowed outside the control of kings and conquerors. Even when a library was raided, manuscripts stored in private homes, mosques, or desert hideaways continued the tradition. Sufi thought also shaped Timbuktu's unique style of scholarship. Unlike many intellectual centers dominated by rigid hierarchies, Timbuktu encouraged gentle debate. Scholars disagreed without hostility. They corrected one another with humility. They believed truth emerged not through victory, but through sincere exploration. This atmosphere allowed students to ask bold questions without fear. It also allowed new ideas to flourish. One manuscript describes the universe as a vast ocean of divine attributes, with humanity as a reflection of that ocean. Another speaks of knowledge as a light that dims when the seeker loses humility. Another suggests that justice is not merely a legal concept but a cosmic principle, an alignment between the human world and the divine. These ideas, born of Sufi contemplation, gave Timbuktu's scholarship its soul. Even centuries later, when modern researchers opened these manuscripts for the first time, many felt a strange sensation, an emotional stirring, as if the pages carried not only information but presence. A sense of someone thinking, someone feeling, someone seeking truth across the centuries. Many scholars describe it the same way. You can feel the lives inside the pages, because these manuscripts were not simply written. They were lived, and in them, the Sufi spirit of Timbuktu continues to whisper, seek, question, purify, understand, become. Knowledge is not a destination. It is a journey, one that begins within. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, and yet through every upheaval, the manuscripts of Timbuktu remained alive. Not because of states or armies, but because of families. Ordinary families with extraordinary devotion. The guardianship of knowledge was never a job assigned by a king or enforced by decree. It was something inherited, almost instinctively, as naturally as one inherits a name, a story, a scar. By the modern era, these guardians had become legends in their own right, not warriors, but protectors whose weapons were silence, patience, and unshakable loyalty to the past. They lived not in palaces, but in modest homes. Homes that carried the scent of dust and ink, of old leather and desert wind. Homes with shelves built by hand, chests polished smooth by generations of opening and closing their lids. Homes where manuscripts were not artifacts, they were family members. To understand the library families of Timbuktu is to understand what it means to live with history as a daily companion. In many households, children grew up playing near trunks filled with centuries-old manuscripts. They learned early to tread lightly, to never set food or drink near the chests, to avoid touching the pages unless an elder allowed it. Before they learned to read, they learned to respect. Before they understood the content of a manuscript, they understood its weight. There were families whose collections numbered in the hundreds, and others who guarded libraries of thousands. Some manuscripts had been copied by great-grandfathers. Others had been rescued during invasions, carried across dunes wrapped in cloth. Some bore the marks of travel, scratches from camel saddlebags, stains from desert storms. Others looked pristine, protected with almost parental tenderness. Every manuscript held a memory, a story of survival, a sacrifice, a journey, and the guardians remembered them all. Among the most well-known families were the Haidaras, whose lineage contained scholars, scribes, teachers, and librarians stretching back centuries. In their home, manuscripts were stacked in neat rows, wrapped in embroidered cloth cases, each one catalogued in memory by an elder who could tell you not only its title, but its origin, its commentary, the reason it mattered. To sit in the Haidara library was to feel time pressing in from all sides, each book a thread in a tapestry too immense to fully unravel. The Kadi family guarded another famous collection, one that included manuscripts written in Andalusia before the fall of Muslim Spain. These texts had been carried across the sea by ancestors seeking refuge, then carried further into the desert by their descendants. Generations later, the Kadis still treated these manuscripts not as relics of a lost homeland, but as living bridges between continents and eras. Their library was more than a collection. It was a testament to resilience across borders. But many library families remained unknown to the world. Their collections were smaller but no less precious. A farmer might own a single manuscript copied by a great-grandfather, an inheritance cherished more than land. A merchant might guard a chest of poetry and prayer books, passed down despite drought, famine, and war. A widow might keep a manuscript hidden in a cloth sack beneath her bed, the final gift of a husband who had died teaching. These families were not wealthy. Some lived in homes that needed repair. Some struggled to pay for schooling or medicine. Yet when offered money for their manuscripts, sometimes large sums, they refused. Not out of arrogance or stubbornness, but because the manuscripts were part of their identity. Selling one would feel like selling a piece of themselves. And it was not only manuscripts they preserved, It was knowledge in its purest form. In the evenings, elders recited teachings from memory. They told stories of scholars who had debated under moonlight, of caravans that carried books instead of gold, of ancestors who risked their lives to protect a single page. Children listened with wide eyes, absorbing their heritage long before they could decode the calligraphy inked on the paper. But the modern era brought new challenges. The world was changing. Climate change threatened the stability of mud-brick homes. Termites gnawed at old wooden chests. Rising humidity warped pages. Economic pressures tempted younger generations to leave the city in search of opportunity. And for the first time in centuries, guardians feared they might fail. Not because of invaders or conquerors, but because time itself was eroding what they held most sacred. In response, some family leaders began quietly organizing efforts to preserve the manuscripts more systematically. They contacted researchers. They collaborated with preservation experts. They learned modern conservation techniques. They sought safer storage conditions. They documented what had never been formally documented before. And yet, even amid modernization, the emotional gravity of their work never diminished. One librarian recalled the first time he opened a chest that had not been touched in decades. Dust rose like a ghost. The manuscripts inside were as fragile as autumn leaves. He described feeling as though ancestors were watching him, as though letting his hands shake would dishonor everyone who had guarded those pages before him. Another guardian spoke of the anxiety he felt each time he checked on his collection during the rainy season. Every drip from the ceiling, every crack in the wall, every shift in humidity felt like a threat to history itself. He slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, always ready to move his manuscripts if danger approached. Yet there was pride too deep, steady pride. The guardians knew they were doing something few in the world would ever understand. They were protecting not only books, but the memory of civilizations. They were preserving knowledge that might reshape the world's understanding of Africa. They were holding on to truths that had survived invasions, colonialism, and neglect, not because of governments, but because of families who believed in the sanctity of the written word. The manuscripts lived because the guardians lived for them. By the time modern crises emerged, new wars, extremist threats, political instability, the families were ready in ways even they did not fully realize. Centuries of hiding, safeguarding, and preserving had trained them to respond with courage, coordination, and quiet brilliance. When danger came again, they did not panic. They remembered, they acted, they protected. Because in Timbuktu, history is not a distant past. It is a living companion, a responsibility carried in the blood, a light that cannot be allowed to go out. And as the world continued to shift around them, the guardians of today prepared for one of the most daring, courageous acts of preservation the city had ever seen. A rescue that would not be silent this time. A rescue carried out under the eyes of the world. A rescue that would prove once more that knowledge survives because people choose to save it. The danger did not arrive all at once. It crept toward Timbuktu slowly, like a shadow stretching across the desert. First a rumor, then a whisper, then a tremor in the hearts of those who remembered history too well. By early 2012, the city's greatest fear was awakening once more. Armed militants, driven by extremism and fueled by ideological rigidity, advanced steadily toward northern Mali. Village after village fell. Towns surrendered. And as the lines on the map shifted, everyone in Timbuktu understood one thing with chilling clarity. The manuscripts were in danger. Not from conquerors seeking wealth like in centuries past. Not from scholars hoping to seize knowledge. But from men who viewed knowledge itself as a threat. The militants who approached the city did not tolerate debate, philosophy, or intellectual freedom. They rejected scholarship, banned books, destroyed heritage sites, and imposed a worldview so narrow it crushed anything outside it. To them, manuscripts, especially those dealing with philosophy, astronomy, mysticism, and law, were not treasures. They were targets. The guardians sensed what was coming long before the militants arrived. They saw it in the refugees fleeing south, in the caravans that stopped coming, in the markets growing quieter with each passing week. They heard it in the shifting tone of radio broadcasts, in the footsteps of soldiers retreating from the north. Timbuktu had been here before. It had survived invasions from Morocco, colonial intrusions, and political turmoil. But this new threat was different. It was not driven by conquest. It was driven by destruction. And the militants were getting closer. When they finally entered Timbuktu, the city fell into an eerie silence. Streets that once echoed with prayer and scholarly conversation now trembled with fear. Pickup trucks mounted with machine guns prowled the roads. Black flags fluttered where children once played. Armed men patrolled the mosques, tore down signs, banned music, and imposed laws with brutal speed. They announced that un-Islamic texts must be destroyed. For the Guardians, these words were knives. Manuscripts that had survived 500 years of sandstorms, wars, and political upheaval might now be burned in minutes. Knowledge preserved through generations could be reduced to ash by a single match. Families who had guarded their collections for centuries understood instantly that they were facing the greatest threat since the Moroccan invasion of 1591. The manuscripts had to be saved. Immediately, in those first terrifying days, librarians worked quietly, pretending to go about their daily lives. But beneath their calm expressions, plans were forming. The guards at the Ahmed Baba Institute, a newly built archive housing tens of thousands of manuscripts, felt time tightening around them like a fist. Flames were coming. Extremism was coming. And every minute mattered. Then, one night, the militants made their intentions clear. They burned a historic mausoleum. A structure that had stood for centuries, a sacred monument, was reduced to smoke and rubble. The fire lit up the night sky with a horrifying glow, casting flickering light on the ancient city walls. The heat, the screams, the crackling wood, the smell of destruction. They all carried a message the Guardians understood like a blow to the chest. They will burn everything. There was no more time. The librarians gathered in secret. Men like Abdulkader Haidara, descendant of a legendary manuscript-keeping family, understood that the manuscripts at the Ahmed Baba Institute were sitting in a visible, vulnerable building. A single fire could wipe out thousands of irreplaceable works. If the manuscripts were to live, they could no longer remain in one place. They had to disappear. Into homes, into mud huts, into hidden rooms, into the desert, anywhere but the library. The rescue had to begin that night. Working silently, under cover of darkness, librarians and volunteers entered the archive with sacks, metal boxes, and waterproof trunks. They moved quickly, stacking manuscripts into bundles, wrapping them in layers of cloth. Every sound, the rustling of pages, the creak of wooden shelves, felt dangerously loud. Every minute they expected armed men to burst through the doors. But fear did not stop them. They worked until dawn, and again the next night, and the night after that. Night after night, manuscripts disappeared from the library shelves, not stolen, but liberated. During the day, women carried bundles hidden beneath their clothes, pretending to be running errands. Young men transported manuscripts in rice sacks balanced on their backs, blending into markets and alleyways. Some manuscripts were smuggled by donkey cart, hidden beneath vegetables. Others slipped through checkpoints disguised as ordinary packages. The militants never suspected the scale of the operation unfolding around them. The Guardians formed an invisible network, a silent army armed only with courage. They risked execution if discovered, but they continued. They knew what depended on them. They had inherited stories of ancestors who had hidden manuscripts from the Moroccans. Now it was their turn to resist the darkness of another age. One librarian later said, "We hid manuscripts everywhere. In bedrooms, under beds, in cupboards, in trunks, in attics. Anyone who had a hiding place became a sanctuary." Some manuscripts were stored in houses so small and fragile that a single fire or stray bullet could have destroyed them. Others were carried out of Timbuktu entirely, transported by boat along the Niger River to safer towns in the south. Boatmen risked detection by militants patrolling the riverbanks. Some journeys took days. Every splash of water, every sound in the night, carried danger. But the manuscripts kept moving. By the time the militants realized something was happening, most of the collection had already vanished. They stormed the Ahmed Baba Institute expecting to find treasure. Instead, they found empty shelves and silence. In frustration, they torched the building. Flames roared through the halls. Documents left behind, duplicate books, damaged texts, administrative files, burned with a choking smoke that drifted over the city. News reports later described the fire as a tragedy. And it was. But the militants did not know the truth. Timbuktu had already rescued its soul. The manuscripts had escaped. Through bravery, coordination, and sheer determination, families had smuggled more than 350,000 pages out of the city. Some were hidden in villages. Others buried in desert hideouts. Many were sent south to Bamako. Each journey was perilous. Each manuscript at risk. But the guardians never stopped. Months later, when the militants were pushed out and the city began to breathe again, the world learned the truth. The manuscripts lived. Not because of any government. Not because of any army. But because ordinary people refused to let knowledge die. When journalists interviewed the rescuers, many of them spoke with quiet humility. It was our duty. We had to do it. The manuscripts belonged to all of humanity. They never boasted. They never sought recognition. But the world recognized them anyway, because in one of the darkest chapters in Timbuktu's history, they had carried out an act of pure courage, an act worthy of every ancestor who had ever copied a manuscript by lamplight, who had ever hidden a text beneath a floorboard, who had ever believed that knowledge must endure. And in the firelit nights of Timbuktu, the guardians proved once more, empires burn, armies fall, but ideas protected by the brave survive. When the militants withdrew and the dust of occupation began to settle, the mood in Timbuktu was not relief, it was uncertainty. The city had been scarred. Walls bore bullet marks. Mausoleums lay in rubble. Silence clung to the streets like a shroud. And behind closed doors, the guardians held their breath, waiting to see whether the manuscripts they had risked everything to protect had truly survived. For months, thousands of manuscripts lived in hiding, stuffed inside metal trunks, buried beneath sand, locked in closets, hidden beneath beds, tucked inside walls. Some had traveled through darkness on donkey carts. Others had floated down the Niger River, packed tightly in canoes. Many were now sitting in makeshift storage rooms in Bamako, hundreds of miles away, vulnerable to humidity, insects, and heat. They were safe from militants, but they were not yet safe from time. When the first crates were opened after the city's liberation, librarians felt a strange fear, an emotion deeper than dread. These manuscripts had been moved in secret, often hurriedly, sometimes roughly. They had endured scorching sun, sudden storms, and jostling across dirt roads. Some trunks had been dented, some cloth wrappings torn. No one knew how many pages had been damaged, how many texts stained by river water, how many bindings frayed by the desert's shifting sands. So the guardians gathered, not as smugglers this time, but as caretakers. They approached the crates with trembling hands, lifting each manuscript with reverence. Some cried, some prayed, some whispered the names of ancestors whose hands had once touched those same pages. And slowly they realized something astonishing. Most of the manuscripts had survived intact. Yes, some covers had warped. Some ink had faded. Some pages were brittle. But the words, the ideas were alive. Felt like witnessing rebirth. The guardians exhaled, some collapsing into chairs with relief, others holding manuscripts to their foreheads in gratitude. After months of fear, the city finally had hope. Hope but not certainty. Because now came the second battle, preservation. The manuscripts, stored hastily in Bamako's humid climate, were deteriorating far faster than they ever had in Timbuktu's dry desert air. In their home city, moisture was rare, insects fewer, temperatures more stable. In the south, humidity seeped into pages like a slow poison. Mold threatened the ink. Termites lurked. Mildew crept across bindings. What had been saved from bullets might now be lost to moisture. So the guardians, alongside librarians, archivists, and international conservators, began an urgent mission, one that required science, patience, and ingenuity. Rooms had to be transformed into climate-controlled environments. Shelves had to be built from non-acidic materials. Manuscripts had to be unwrapped, cleaned, flattened, dried. Binding threads had to be repaired. Damaged pages had to be stabilized. It was painstaking work. Every manuscript had its own challenges. Some were stiff and curled from heat. Others were soft from humidity. Some pages were stuck together like delicate leaves after rain. Conservators used brushes finer than those used for painting eyelashes, tweezers the size of needles, and tools warmed to just the right temperature. They worked slowly, sometimes spending days on a single page. For the Guardians, this work was emotional. Many had risked their lives to save these manuscripts. Now they watched experts treat them with the same respect and care. It felt like a shared act of redemption, a quiet triumph over destruction. But preservation was only part of the mission. The manuscripts needed more than physical safety. They needed recognition. They needed to be understood, studied, catalogued, and eventually shared with the world. So scholars gathered from Mali, Europe, America, and the Middle East. They brought scanners, digital cameras, cataloging software. They worked side by side with Timbuktu's own librarians, who knew the collections better than anyone else alive. Digitization began. Each manuscript was photographed one page at a time under carefully balanced lighting. Every shadow had to be eliminated, every crease documented, every annotation preserved. This was not simply photographing books, it was rescuing memory. Some manuscripts took hours to digitize, others days. The process was slow, meticulous, almost ritualistic. The first time a digitized page appeared on a screen, showing crisp calligraphy written centuries earlier, the room fell silent. The Guardians stared at the image, stunned. For the first time in history, a page that had been copied by candlelight generations ago now existed in a form that could never burn. It was like watching immortality take root. Digitization gave the manuscripts a second life, one that no extremist, no fire, no termite could ever erase. And the Guardians realized they had achieved something extraordinary. Not only had they saved the physical texts, they had opened a door to the future. But even as digitization continued, another task loomed. Returning the manuscripts to Timbuktu. The city was still fragile. Security was uncertain. Roads were dangerous. Extremists remained active in the region. Returning the manuscripts too soon could undo everything. But keeping them away forever would sever Timbuktu from its own soul. So the Guardians debated, argued, planned. This decision weighed heavier than any they had ever made. They consulted elders, scholars, preservation experts. And after many sleepless nights, they reached a conclusion. The manuscripts would return. Not immediately, not recklessly, but someday when it was safe. Because the manuscripts belonged to Timbuktu like rivers belong to valleys, like stars belong to the night sky. They were part of the city's heartbeat. Removing them permanently would be like removing its memory. In the meantime, the manuscripts continued to be preserved, digitized, and studied. New generations of Malians were trained in conservation science. Libraries received international support. Workshops were held to teach traditional binding techniques to young apprentices. Women who had once carried manuscripts hidden beneath their clothes now taught their daughters how to preserve them properly. Elders told stories that had been whispered for centuries, now recorded so they would never be lost again. The rescue had become something larger than preservation. It had become renewal, a renewal of pride in Mali's heritage, a renewal of Timbuktu's identity, a renewal of global respect for African intellectual history. And in quiet rooms filled with soft light and the scent of old paper, the Guardians felt something they had not felt in years, a sense of victory, because the militants had tried to destroy centuries of knowledge. Instead, they sparked a movement that protected it more fiercely than ever before, a movement that ensured the manuscripts would not only survive but thrive. For the first time in centuries, the manuscripts were not hiding. They were rising, rising into light, rising into recognition, rising into the future. Because knowledge, when protected with courage, does not merely endure. It triumphs. Once the manuscripts were safe, preserved, and slowly breathing back into the world, something unexpected began to happen. Something larger than any scholar, librarian, or guardian had predicted. The global spotlight slowly turned toward Timbuktu, and in that light, the city revealed its profound truth. It had never been a ruin of the past. It had always been a beacon for the future. What began as an act of survival became a renaissance. The world, long accustomed to seeing Africa through a narrow lens, suddenly found itself confronted with a narrative that shattered assumptions. Newspapers ran front-page stories. Researchers flew across continents. Museums issued statements of admiration. International audiences asked a question that echoed through lecture halls, documentaries, and classrooms. How did we not know? How did we not know that a desert city once rivaled the intellectual centers of the world? How did we not know that families safeguarded libraries with the devotion others reserve for children? How did we not know that, in an era obsessed with technology, some of humanity's greatest wisdom had been hiding in trunks, courtyards, and mud-brick walls? The manuscripts, once silent, had become ambassadors. They spoke across borders, telling stories of ancient astronomy, poetic brilliance, legal sophistication, and spiritual depth. They revealed a world where scholars traveled by camel to debate metaphysics, where caravans carried books alongside salt and gold, where intellectual freedom flourished under desert stars. And everywhere the manuscripts were shown, they sparked a transformation. Universities added courses on West African intellectual history. Scholars formed teams to translate manuscripts into dozens of languages. Curators reevaluated the place of Africa in global heritage. Teachers incorporated Timbuktu into world history curricula. For the first time, children in distant countries learned that Africa had produced not only kingdoms, but knowledge, beautiful, advanced, world-shaping knowledge. In Mali, this recognition felt like medicine to a wounded spirit. For decades, narratives of poverty, conflict, and instability had overshadowed the country's cultural richness. But now, the manuscripts reminded the world, and Malians themselves, that the nation's history was not defined by crisis, but by brilliance. Young people in Bamako and Timbuktu suddenly found new role models in ancient scholars whose names had been forgotten outside their lineage. Schools held writing competitions inspired by manuscript poetry. Students learned calligraphy as an art form, a link to their intellectual ancestors. The guardians watched all this with a mix of pride and disbelief. They had spent their lives protecting manuscripts quietly, secretly, convinced the world was uninterested. Now, researchers traveled thousands of miles to sit with them, to interview them, to honor their bravery. Their work, once done in shadows, was celebrated in conferences and exhibitions. Some guardians were awarded international prizes. Others spoke at forums they had never dreamed of attending. But even amid the recognition, they remained humble. When asked why they risked their lives, they gave the same quiet answer: because this knowledge is who we are. As attention grew, efforts to rebuild Timbuktu gained momentum. Architects studied its ancient mosques, analyzing how mud brick structures had withstood centuries of weather. Conservationists developed new strategies to protect manuscripts from climate change. NGOs supported the construction of safer library spaces. Digital archives expanded rapidly, uploading thousands of pages online. Scholars around the world could now read Timbuktu's manuscripts with a single click, a miracle that still feels surreal. But the greatest impact of the global revival of interest was not academic. It was emotional. For centuries, the world had doubted Timbuktu, dismissed it, turned it into myth, then into ridicule. The city's intellectual legacy had been overlooked, overshadowed, misunderstood, diminished. Now the world was saying something different. We see you. We hear you. We recognize what you preserved. In Timbuktu's streets, still scarred, still healing, this change felt like a quiet dawn. Elders who had witnessed the darkest days of occupation now watched children read manuscript stories on digital tablets. Young girls whose mothers once hid books beneath their robes now attended workshops on conservation science. Teenagers who had fled during the insurgency returned with dreams of becoming archivists, historians, poets, philosophers. The manuscripts were inspiring a new generation, and they were doing something even more profound. They were rebuilding identity, not just for Timbuktu, not just for Mali, but for Africa. For centuries, colonial narratives had claimed that Africa had no written tradition, no academic culture, no philosophical legacy. The manuscripts burned this lie to ashes. They proved, page after page, that Africans had written their histories, developed sophisticated legal systems, studied the cosmos, debated theology, and contemplated the nature of the soul long before foreign powers arrived. They proved that Africa belonged at the table of world civilizations, not as a guest but as a founder. As this truth spread, people across the continent embraced the manuscripts as symbols of continental pride. Cultural festivals celebrated African scholarship. Writers and artists referenced Timbuktu in their work. Nations across West Africa collaborated on manuscript preservation, recognizing shared intellectual heritage. Even in the diaspora, the manuscripts became sources of inspiration for musicians, filmmakers, poets, and activists. The revival also sparked new questions. What else had been lost? What else lay undiscovered in trunks, homes, or forgotten family libraries? How many other African cities had once been monuments of intellect, erased by history's uneven voice? Researchers began hunting for manuscripts in villages across the Sahel. They found thousands more in chests, in caves, in abandoned houses. The story of Timbuktu had opened a door, and the world stepped through eagerly, searching for what else had been neglected. But amid the excitement, one truth remained unchanged. The greatest heroes of this resurgence were not governments, institutions, or academics. They were the families, ordinary men and women who had protected knowledge with their bare hands, who had risked guns and fire, who had carried manuscripts across the desert under moonlight. Their devotion bridged centuries. Their courage revived a legacy. Their love preserved a civilization's memory. And now, as the world rediscovered Timbuktu, the guardians remained at its heart, quiet, steadfast, watching as the seeds they had protected for generations finally bloomed. Because what they preserved was more than books. They preserved identity. They preserved truth. They preserved possibility. And as Timbuktu stepped back into the light, it carried the manuscripts like lanterns, guiding not only scholars, but humanity itself, toward a fuller understanding of what the world once was, and what it could be again. As the manuscripts rose again, digitized, preserved, celebrated, a quieter, deeper transformation unfolded in the minds of those who encountered them. They did more than rewrite history books. They forced the world to confront a question it had avoided for centuries. What if the story of human knowledge is far bigger, far older, far more interconnected than we've been taught? For generations, history had been told like a narrow river flowing from Greece to Rome to Europe to the modern world. Other civilizations were treated as tributaries, important perhaps, but never central. Africa, in particular, was cast as a continent without written memory, without intellectual lineage, without scholarly tradition. A blank page waiting to be written upon. But the manuscripts of Timbuktu shattered that illusion. They revealed an Africa that had been reading, writing, calculating, debating, philosophizing, dreaming, questioning, and recording the universe long before Europe ever discovered it. They showed that knowledge did not flow in one direction, but in cycles, moving across deserts, seas, kingdoms, languages, and cultures. Suddenly, the world was forced to ask itself, what else have we misunderstood? What else lies hidden? What else has been erased? The manuscripts offered answers, not in loud proclamations, but in quiet revelations. One treatise charted the movement of stars with astonishing accuracy, predating similar European diagrams. Another described medical techniques that blended scientific observation with holistic care. A legal manuscript explored arguments for justice that resonated with modern human rights discourse. Poems written centuries ago spoke of love with metaphors as delicate as any penned by Shakespeare. These were not anomalies. They were evidence of intellectual ecosystems, complex, thriving, and profoundly human. And as scholars studied the manuscripts, they discovered something even more extraordinary. The knowledge contained in them was not isolated. It was connected to intellectual traditions spanning Andalusia, Cairo, Baghdad, Persia, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. Ideas had flowed into Timbuktu and flowed out again. Scholars traveled in caravans across continents, carrying not just goods but questions, insights, and discoveries. Manuscripts acted like bridges, linking worlds that modern historians often treat as separate. Timbuktu had been part of a global conversation. Africa had been part of a global conversation. And suddenly, a powerful truth emerged. Human knowledge was never the story of one civilization rising above all others. It was the story of exchange. This realization struck the world with unexpected force. Students in Europe and America began learning about West African philosophers. Historians revised timelines, tracing how ideas once believed to originate in a single place had actually been shaped by multiple cultures. Museums reconsidered how they presented African history, no longer focusing solely on kingdoms and artifacts, but on thoughts, ideas as rich and intricate as any scroll from the Mediterranean. But the greatest philosophical shift came from something simpler, more humbling: the recognition that brilliance can emerge anywhere. In desert cities, in mud-brick homes, in families who teach their children by candlelight, in scholars whose names never appear in mainstream history, in communities that preserve knowledge not for fame, but because they believe in something sacred. The manuscripts reminded the world that genius is not a luxury of wealth or empire. It is a universal human gift, like breath, like hope, like curiosity. And this understanding carried profound implications. If Timbuktu could produce astronomy, law, poetry, mathematics, and metaphysics of such depth, what other places, dismissed or forgotten, might hold intellectual treasures of their own? What cities might have lost their libraries to war or colonization? What traditions might still be hiding in oral histories, buried artifacts, or private homes? The manuscripts ignited a new global curiosity. Not the curiosity of conquerors, not the curiosity of treasure hunters, but the curiosity of equals, of a world finally willing to listen. Yet the manuscripts also raised deeper questions about humanity itself. What does it mean that so much knowledge nearly vanished? What does it reveal about our fragility, that ideas can survive centuries of sandstorms only to be threatened by intolerance? And what does it say about our strength that ordinary people, without wealth, titles, or weapons, saved an intellectual heritage for the entire world? It revealed something profound. Humanity is both fragile and resilient, destroyable and indestructible, forgetful and remembering, flawed and beautiful. The manuscripts became symbols, not of a lost age, but of an enduring truth. Knowledge survives because we choose to protect it. And through this realization came another: history is not a fixed narrative. It is a living organism. It changes as we uncover more of ourselves. The manuscripts did not simply add footnotes to world history. They changed its shape. They expanded the map of memory. They humbled modern arrogance. They reminded humanity that wisdom does not follow a single path. It appears wherever humans seek to understand the world. And as the world absorbed these revelations, something else began to shift. Something intimate, almost spiritual. People saw themselves differently. Africans around the world saw their ancestors not as victims of history, but as creators of it. Young students saw themselves reflected in centuries-old scientific works. Scholars saw global history as a tapestry, not a hierarchy. Humanity saw that the pursuit of truth transcends race, religion, geography, and era. The manuscripts had become mirrors. When people looked into them, they saw not just Timbuktu. They saw themselves. Not their limitations, but their potential. Not their divisions, but their connections. Not their fears, but their capacity to think, create, and endure. And perhaps the greatest philosophical question that emerged from the manuscripts was this: if so much of human brilliance has been forgotten or hidden, how much more is waiting to be rediscovered? What unknown libraries lie beneath desert sands? What treatises sleep in private homes? What wisdom has survived in oral traditions, songs, proverbs, rituals, and memories? What lost conversations between civilizations could transform our understanding of the world? The manuscripts whispered a simple truth. There is more to humanity than we have allowed ourselves to know. And in that realization lies our future. In the calm after Timbuktu's darkest days, the manuscripts stood like survivors who had witnessed far more than they revealed. Their pages, worn and trembling at the edges, carried centuries of breath and memory. But their survival was not fate, it was human courage. Families hid them beneath beds and inside walls. Librarians risked checkpoints, carrying boxes through night streets where silence felt dangerous. Every act of protection whispered the same belief: knowledge must live. Now, as the world finally looked toward Timbuktu, the manuscripts began speaking again, reminding humanity that history survives through those who refuse to let it die. They were more than ink. They were proof that light endures when ordinary people choose to protect it. For Timbuktu, these pages are not relics of a lost world. They are identity. They are inheritance. They are the reminder that memory, when guarded, becomes stronger than any fire. Saving the manuscripts had been only the first miracle. Preserving them was the second. Now came the third, bringing them back to life. After the smuggling, the hiding, the danger, a new question hovered in the air like desert dust. What now? What becomes of a legacy once it has survived destruction? The Guardians understood that preservation was more than climate control, scanners, and archival rooms. It was a rebirth of identity. Young Malians, discovering the manuscripts for the first time, felt something awaken inside them, a connection to ancestors whose brilliance had never been taught in their textbooks. Workshops opened, libraries repaired, calligraphers taught scripts unused for decades. Conservators learned to mend torn parchment. And slowly, Timbuktu's intellectual spirit began returning, piece by piece, like a mosaic rising from ruins. The world, too, leaned closer. Researchers studied astronomy charts more advanced than expected. Historians found legal ideas centuries ahead of their time. Poets deciphered verses that felt alive even now. Timbuktu was no longer a forgotten city. It was a center of rediscovered wisdom. And yet, the manuscripts did more than educate. They warned. They reminded humanity that knowledge can be lost faster than it's created, that archives can vanish in hours, and that memory requires guardians just as much as armies. But above all, they offered possibility. A possibility for Mali to reclaim a legacy, for Africa to redefine its place in world history, and for humanity to rediscover truths buried by time. In the final quiet of this story, one truth shines brighter than all others. Knowledge survives when people decide it must. Timbuktu's manuscripts are proof that courage needs no weapons, only conviction. Families with nothing but hope guarded treasures that belonged not only to Mali, but to the world. Their resilience asks us a question we cannot ignore. What wisdom of our time are we protecting? What truth might disappear if we don't defend it? The manuscript's journey teaches that ideas are fragile, yet astonishingly resilient, surviving when everything else falls. When a reader opens a digitized page today, they are not just learning history. They are continuing it. They become part of a lineage stretching back through scholars, scribes, guardians, and ancestors who believed ideas were worth saving. And so, Timbuktu's story does not end with preservation. It ends with responsibility. The manuscripts now belong to every mind willing to protect them, every student who learns from them, every voice that carries their message forward. Because the greatest lesson they offer is simple and eternal. Empires fade. Fire burns. Time erodes. But knowledge, if protected, outlives everything.